The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 801 Louis Philippe Catastrophe. In addition, there is even more tragic news for the Free State. That is, the Orthodox Alliance has seized the St. Geda Pass, which means that Joseph Loy's blockade plan has completely failed. Ticino connects the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Lombardy region of Austria, which means that the two countries can directly send troops to intervene forcefully. However, the expected situation did not happen. Both Austria and Sardinia behaved very cautiously, even indifferently. Austrian officials in the Lombardy region said they needed to report for instructions, while the Kingdom of Sardinia needed the Swiss to prove that they were Swiss. In fact, Joseph Loy's previous rebellion work was very successful, and the rebellion in Ticino caused great damage to the Kingdom of Sardinia. The Kingdom of Sardinia's aid to the Orthodox Alliance directly turned into funding the enemy, and this material was Carlo Alberto's biggest bargaining chip. In fact, he knew very well that his country could not be compared with Austria and France at all, so Carlo Alberto had previously signed secret agreements with Swiss State Representative Constantin Sigwalt in France. That is, Carlo Alberto will fully support the Orthodox Alliance and will also send a batch of supplies and bribes to Constantin Sigwalt before the war begins. After the victory in the war, the Orthodox Alliance promised to use the state of Ticino as reward. At the same time, the Kingdom of Sardinia's request would be supported by France, at the cost of opposing Austria's over-expansion. In fact, there is a shadow of the British behind this, because Austria has been making small moves in recent years, and the latter has vaguely begun to dominate the European continent. Therefore, the United Kingdom is uniting other countries to oppose Austria's small-scale expansion. However, each country has its own small ideas, and generally speaking, they should be taking advantage of each other. Sardinia and France both wanted to expand, but were afraid that their neighbors would be too strong. The British hoped that the three families would fight as fiercely as possible, so that he could win over them and suppress them. However, Constantin Sigwart did not receive this batch of weapons and supplies at this time, nor did he receive the bribe promised by Carlo Alberto, and the former expressed dissatisfaction with the Kingdom of Sardinia for not directly attacking Ticino. Constantin Sigwart, who had received no actual benefits, would naturally not recognize the previous transaction unless the Kingdom of Sardinia provided another batch of supplies and bribes of the same amount. It's not that Carlo Alberto couldn't take it out, he just felt that it was a loss. Of course, it was also a loss to stop it, which put him in a dilemma. But the biggest loss was that he once asked the French general who occupied Ticino state about the whereabouts of the weapons and funds. The answer was as expected, that is, I don't know. But now, no matter whether the other party knows it or not, I'm afraid that the supplies no longer belong to the Kingdom of Sardinia. After suffering a dull loss, Carlo Alberto began to carefully consider the gains and losses of this war. On the other hand, the French's actions were much more direct. Louis Philippe and his July dynasty could already feel the restless mood of the domestic people. Agricultural harvests have failed year after year, industry has stagnated, and colonial uprisings have continued. Only the financial industry has maintained false prosperity. The acquisition of Alaska development rights did not satisfy the people. On the contrary, under the propaganda of the Orthodox faction, the king's freezer has become the biggest joke in France. In addition, the majestic palaces and Louis Philippe's simple personal life failed to impress the people. Folk banquets continued, and a storm was about to come. At the same time, there were also differences within the Orleans faction. Part of them was the liberals headed by Odilon Barrett, who hoped to further align themselves with the British and use the representative system to weaken the king's power, thereby achieving the ideal state of rule without rule. Another group of people are conservatives represented by Guizot. They feel that the situation in France at this time was caused by the king. Louis Philippe is not a qualified monarch, so just change the king. Although the two factions have differences, their interests are consistent in some aspects. For example, Louis Philippe at this time, his existence has affected the interests of all parties. This is still within the Orleanists. Outside the orthodox, Bonapartist, and unrecognized Democrats and Republicans, their ideas are much more radical. The orthodox faction here refers to the faction that supports the Bourbon dynasty. They hope that Henry V or Count Chambord can be crowned King of France and re-establish the Orthodox dynasty. Although the Orthodox faction has been liquidated to a certain extent, they still have considerable influence in southwestern France, especially those backward provinces, and they will also be the main force supporting Count Chambord in the future. The Bonapartist faction was relatively chaotic. Some supported Napoleon's brothers, while others supported his nephew. Some even felt that they were Napoleon's successor. Most of them have military backgrounds, so Louis Philippe has no good way to deal with them. But these people are not of the same mind as the Orleans dynasty. The Bonapartists are very willing to see Louis Philippe's rule unstable and the Orleans dynasty collapse internally, so that their emperor can more easily come to power. As for the Republicans and liberals who were outside the government, they were even more radical. They were ready for another French Revolution. However, regardless of the faction, it has almost become a consensus to send King Yali, Louis Philippe, to the guillotine. Louis Philippe naturally felt the crisis. In fact, the French were more direct than the Austrians. In 1846 alone, Louis Philippe suffered 18 assassinations, but the most dangerous incident was in the second week of 1847, when Louis Philippe's motorcade passed through Avant-Garden, and several gunmen took the opportunity to launch an attack. The accompanying team fell into chaos. If the Queen hadn't shouted and drove her guards back, Louis Philippe would have died. In the end, the guards fought off the attackers, but 2 bullets still hit the King's car directly. One of the bullets landed 5 centimeters away from Louis Philippe's forehead, but this time he did not look embarrassed. On the contrary, he actually participated in the dance like nothing happened. The assassins come from a variety of sources, including domestic factions, religious fanatics from Spain, killers hired by Algeria and Morocco, people who cannot survive, businessmen whose businesses have failed, and even retired military officers. At this time, strife was serious among the French army, especially senior officers who could easily make life worse than death for junior officers. Among them was an officer named Pierre Leconte. He was born in 1798. He enlisted in the Royal Guards in 1814 and participated in the Spanish campaign of 1823. He was later promoted to non-commissioned officer and was awarded the French Legion of Honor for his outstanding performance medal. Pierre Leconte rose through the ranks while serving as a volunteer in the Greek War of Independence, starting as a second lieutenant, then a lieutenant, and then a captain. In 1829, he successfully entered the forest management team of the Duke of Orleans as a civilian by virtue of his own merit, where he continued to serve as the chief forest ranger of Fontainebleau. Chapter 802 The Redemption of Louis Philippe. This position is not high, but it has a high status and allows you to enjoy many privileges and a very generous pension. However, because Pierre Leconte refused to carry out the orders of his superiors, he was directly expelled from the military and lost the pension he deserved. He could only live on relief funds every day. In the end, Mr. Pierre Leconte, who was nearly 50 years old, chose the most drastic way to recover his pension. In fact, many people in France hope that Pierre Leconte will succeed so that they can pin those charges on their competitors. However, when voting on whether to sentence him to death, of the nearly 300 members of the entire parliament, only Hugo and 2 other nobles voted against it. The minimum sentence for assassinating a monarch is life imprisonment, but at this time France has begun to study the abolition of the death penalty. By the way, the first person to propose the abolition of the death penalty in Congress was the French mass executioner Robespierre. Louis Philippe, of course, wrote an open letter as usual. My former forest guard of Fontainebleau, my councillors all feel unanimously and strongly that in this case my responsibilities do not allow me to interfere with the freedom of the judicial process, and although I deeply regret that the decision has been made for me, his only purpose is to show that the pot belongs to others closer to home. At this point even the stupidest person knows that there is nothing they can do unless they do something. Louis Philippe did not want to be someone else's scapegoat. He felt that he could use more land and more victories to dilute the negative emotions of the people. So Louis Philippe's envoy was the first to come to Vienna, and everything went smoothly. In addition to a personal letter from the king, there was also a batch of valuable gifts the special envoy directly found Metternich, and the latter naturally had no reason to reject the former Louis Philippe's special envoy was Baron Pasquier, who was Louis Philippe's most trusted subordinate and the Chamberlain-in-Chief of Secret Services of the Orleans dynasty. There was not much nonsense between the two parties. Baron Pasquier directly stated his intention, which was Louis Philippe's offer. In view of the precarious situation of the Orthodox Union and the Swiss Civil War, France and Austria should shoulder the responsibility of great powers and divide the Swiss land into 2 equal parts and place it under our management. Louis Philippe's idea was obviously too naive, but Metternich couldn't say it directly, so he could only say it. I'm afraid this is not good. The Swiss Confederation is our ally, brothers of the same religion and clan. The German-speaking population in Switzerland accounts for 2/3, the Italian-speaking population accounts for about 10%, and the rest is the French-speaking population. This means that Austria is sure to seamlessly connect with 80% of the Swiss population. The French side naturally understood what Metternich meant, and had already made plans, considering the friendship between France and Austria, and also considering your country's influence in Switzerland. The kind and generous King Philip I is willing to give up the Valais canton to your country. Valais is a state with a predominantly Italian-speaking population, and the place is surrounded by mountains and rivers. The beautiful scenery and clear waters mean that the land is desolate. In fact, if Austria swallows the 2 states of Ticino and Valais, it will undoubtedly attract the hatred of the Kingdom of Sardinia. After all, Carl Alberto wants to expand territory. If it weren't for the weak national strength of the Kingdom of Sardinia and the fact that the great powers had taken over all the good colonial places, he would definitely want to get involved. The Kingdom of Sardinia has a colonial ministry, but it has not colonized any area so far. Prince Metternich actually didn't want to make too many enemies, especially after the marriage between the Kingdom of Sardinia and Austria. He hoped to win over Carlo Alberto to deal with France and realize Austria's ambitions in Italy. The most important thing is that Valais is only one state and cannot satisfy the appetite of the Austrian Empire. The development over the years has convinced Metternich that this country has been completely transformed. As long as Britain and Russia do not take action, he can do whatever he wants. Sorry, I cannot agree with your point of view. As the Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire, I must make the most appropriate judgment carefully. Here is my latest battle report, which may change your mind. Metternich then handed Baron Pasquier a battle report that had been compiled and bound into a volume. This actually shows the strength of Austria's intelligence agencies, the efficiency of its administration, and its strong self-confidence. The latter took the battle report very calmly, but was secretly frightened because the handwriting was too neat, and it would take an experienced scribe 3 to 4 hours just to copy the 6 pages of the report. Coupled with these complicated modifications, it can only be said that Austria's administrative agencies and intelligence agencies are really powerful. In fact, this was due to the help of typewriters, which more than doubled the efficiency of those clerks, especially in terms of neatness. It is an unimaginable improvement. In this era, a professional scribe can usually write 60 to 100 characters per minute, but with the help of a typewriter, and after a period of training, they can easily achieve 200 plus. In addition, don't think it's an exaggeration. In the international speed recording competition of the last century, scores of 800 plus and 700 plus per minute were common. In 1920, due to the advancement of typewriters, for the first time someone could type faster than 600 plus, which included words, numbers, and various symbols. Only if they were all accurate could the results be recorded. The typewriter was first born in 1808. There is a beautiful legend about it. That is, the inventor Pilarinicheri did not do it to make money, but to help his blind girlfriend. Although the prototype is gone, Franz has seen too many similar things, such as transmitters and keyboards. The first commercial typewriter in history was invented by Austrian designer Peter Mitterhofer, but at this time the designer from Tyrol had just turned 17. As compensation, he received a letter of admission from the University of Vienna and more opportunities to express himself. Historically, the fate of this designer was not good. Due to the patent protection mechanism of the Austrian Empire at that time, the Danes could plagiarize/learn from his designs unscrupulously. In the end, the American Christopher Larsen Shaw's became the father of the typewriter and was admired by the world. After the Austro-Prussian War, Peter Mithofer was completely disappointed with the new Austro-Hungarian Empire and decided to leave his country. Peter Mithofer, who came to the United States to pursue his dream, eventually died of freezing and starvation on the streets of New York in 1874 at the age of 44. Although he has no chance to invent the typewriter now, Franz gave him a chance to live out the rest of his life. Vienna, Chancellery. Baron Pasquia's face remained unchanged after reading the battle report, but his heart was in turmoil. Although the Orthodox Alliance's successive victories will not tip the balance, Archduke Karol is in Switzerland, commanding the Orthodox Alliance's army. This news is so serious. Chapter 803 War of Attrition. A royal member of the Austrian Empire is in Switzerland. A hero who once fought against Napoleon is in Switzerland, and a destabilizing factor is at the center of this storm. This can explain why the Orthodox Alliance suddenly changed its strategy, but this is definitely not good news for France. Archduke Karol is in Switzerland. This message may actually have multiple meanings. Austria wants to unilaterally end Swiss civil war. Austria wants more benefits. Austria and the Orthodox Alliance have reached some kind of agreement. Austria already has de facto control over the Orthodox Union. Austria wants to annex Switzerland. Baron Pasquia did not dare to think further, but it was not wise to break up with Austria or directly launch a war to seize territory. Louis Philippe's bottom line was to give up the cantons of Argau and Valais, but now it seems a bit too whimsical. At this time, he remembered Metternich's previous words. The other party seemed to want to ask for a bribe. Your Excellency, we in France are willing to give up the canton of Argau again. At the same time, we are also willing to solve your debt problem in Ochsenhausen and fund you with another 1 million francs to rebuild the manor. To be honest, the bribe was not small, at least much higher than that paid to Russian Prime Minister Hilarion. But the problem was that the French bid was too low and completely failed to meet the psychological expectations of Austria and Metternich. According to Franz's plan, the negotiations need to be delayed further. Metternich certainly knew what to do. Let me think about it. Just wait for my news, Baron. Pasquia still wanted to fight for it, but the other party had already issued an eviction order. He could not say anything more, and could only send the news back to Paris as soon as he left. Switzerland, on the other hand. Doufre's attack was very unsatisfactory, because most battlefields were very unfavorable to the Free State Alliance, or whichever side attacked was disadvantageous. The terrain is narrow, and it is difficult for troops to deploy, and solid defense facilities are difficult to destroy. In fact, it is not that those fortresses are really strong. Compared with the new concrete structures, they are still much worse. The main problem is the lack of heavy artillery and the monotony of the offensive mode. The 12-pound field gun is already considered a heavy artillery in the eyes of the Swiss, but in fact, 12-pound guns may not be able to show off their power on the North American battlefield at this time, and the siege guns of major countries are generally above 24-pound. At the same time, Doufre also lacked offensive means. Every time a strong attack failed, he chose to take a detour. However, every time he took a detour, he would be blocked by Archduke Karol, as if he was cheating, and then he would be defeated. Doufre once suspected that the other party would use witchcraft, because several of his extremely covert attacks were intercepted by the enemy. This was simply impossible, unless there were spies in his headquarters. Such questions will remain if they never see the observation balloon floating in the sky. In addition, the muddy roads made it difficult to maintain supplies, and the morale of the soldiers who were unable to attack for a long time dropped sharply. This is fatal to the new recruits. If they don't have enough to eat or wear warm clothes, they will lose in one fight. Doufre is not a cruel person, but at this moment he must resolutely enforce military law and let the officers and soldiers see his determination. Otherwise the situation will become uncontrollable. However, if he shot all the soldiers who escaped every day, he would become Robespierre of Switzerland, so he could only use an ancient military law, which was to kill at 11. However, this approach could not scare anyone at all. Doufre could only ask for more reinforcement and supplies. He hoped to use supplies and people to pile up the Orthodox alliance to death. It must be said that Joseph Loy was a qualified leader. Even though almost all the free states opposed the continued appointment of Dufa, he still insisted on trusting the veteran. But it is impossible for those free states to continue to provide money and personnel. However, there happened to be 2 Orthodox states that had surrendered, especially Freiburg state, which has a large number of disbanded Orthodox Union soldiers. So Joseph Loy asked Freiburg and Zug to assume war obligations in the name of the Federation, which was actually in order. Since these 2 states had surrendered, they were lambs to be slaughtered. Joseph Roy quickly raised another 100,000 troops for Dufa. However, Augustin Keller's defeat in the canton of Schwyz still had a considerable impact on the Swiss Confederation. The top leaders of the canton of Zug initially surrendered because they did not want the war to burn to their homes. Now that Augustin Keller is dead, the promise not to let them go to the front line is also invalidated. As a result, Zug state not only has to recruit a large number of young men to join the army, but also has to pay for the war, and its home has become a battlefield. Several senior officials in Zug canton dare not go out for fear of being scolded by their elders in their hometown. In addition, Tanneramt's guerrillas were not wiped out. They took advantage of the complex terrain of the mountainous area to appear and hide, making Free Hilosso's army unable to move. Ordinary local troops and militiamen were no match for the guerrillas, and Free Hilosso's main force had too big a target and too slow movements, forcing the opponent to move back and forth on its own territory. Tanneramt's fighting method is the most common mercenary mode. He fights if he can win, and runs if he can't. He specializes in picking weak enemies, but because the attacks were all on official warehouses, the local people usually chose to turn a blind eye. In addition, as the war took a turn for the worse, people's lives became worse and worse. Tanneramt's guerrillas became people's idols. Free Hilosso's lies were discovered, and coupled with his long-term lack of achievements, the Swiss Confederation became increasingly distrustful of him, and he himself became increasingly manic. As a result, it was not uncommon for soldiers to be whipped and then beaten into submission, and even more so, the army was like bandits, and the bandits were like the army. At the Lucerne state command, Archduke Karol sat on a rocking chair and took a nap. The captain of the guard, Sigismund, used iron tongs to make the fire as bright as possible to make the room warmer. If it weren't for the sand table in the middle and the map on the wall, it would be hard to believe that this is the high command of the Orthodox Alliance. In fact, Dufa's army was not very mobile, and the cold weather in winter restricted it even more. Constantin Sigvort and Ulrich Salas were very busy because they never thought that the army would consume supplies like this. The 2 of them expanded the original 40,000 troops to 100,000 despite the objections of Archduke Karol. As a result, the front line did not collapse, but the logistics was about to collapse first. Switzerland has a sparse population and barren land, and does not have high war potential. However, due to the implementation of the compulsory conscription system and the tradition of mercenaries, the number of soldiers it can mobilize in a short period of time is far higher than that of ordinary countries. However, the huge contrast between the 2 will quickly worsen the situation. But this is not what Archduke Karol cares about, because the other party's situation will be worse than that of the Orthodox Alliance. What really concerned him was what did the chess players behind the scenes want to do. Chapter 804 The Gear of Destiny. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz had a new guest, Viroy Sadani, one of the richest businessmen in India at this time, who had greater power in Trivandrum than the Maharaja. However, Viroy Sadani did not rise up, nor did he ask the British for the position of prince, but chose to continue to be an obedient citizen. This is somewhat elusive, and his shadow is behind almost everything that has happened in the Indian subcontinent in recent years. Governor-General of India, Henry Harding, specifically stated the threat posed by this man before leaving office. However, his successor soon gave the opposite evaluation. Coupled with the change of government, this matter did not attract the attention of senior officials in London. However, this man who has everything to do with the power of the Indian subcontinent is currently lying on the ground, not even daring to breathe. If Lakshmi Pai on the side had been in the past, she would have been curious about why Viroy Sadani, the uncrowned king of the Mughal Empire, was so humble. Now she understands that the so-called Uncrowned king is just a puppet on strings. Austria, a small country, has energy that is not inferior to that of the British. If it were a land battle, I'm afraid that even the warriors of the entire Mughal Empire would not be able to match it. Lakshmi Pai is from Zangsi, and Zangsi is actually a state of the Mughal Empire in name, so she feels that she is a subject of the Mughal Empire. In fact, in the past 2 years, Lakshmi Pai has gained a new understanding of Britain and Europe. She understands that these people cannot be defeated by 1 or 2 warriors or heroes, and if you are not strong enough, if you kill one, there will be another one. But the reform was not something she could complete alone. Perhaps this was why the prince sent her here. Although Villa Dani's performance this time was much more submissive than before, this careerist still did not tell the whole truth. What is even more disgusting is that he actually wants to replace the Sassoon family. Franz doesn't like this kind of greedy and smart-assed ally who doesn't have enough strength at all. Henry Harding was a direct descendant of Robert Peel, so it was not surprising that he was replaced by John Russell. In fact, another point was that the governor with a military background was unwilling to make concessions on many issues, which affected the interests of too many people. Henry Harding's departure from India was in some ways a good thing, but in the short term it was troublesome because his successor, Earl Dalhousie, was a workaholic. In fact, the Earl of Dalhousie was promoted by Robert Peel, but the former was also a good friend of John Russell's cousin, Baron Palmer. Never avoid relatives when promoting good people, so Earl Dalhousie became the new Governor General of India. His methods were very radical, and his crazy expansion and total westernization triggered a series of wars and ethnic conflicts, and eventually triggered the Indian national revolt. But it is undeniable that Earl Dalhousie is very capable, and this person is very xenophobic. I'm afraid that Austria and France's colonies in India will be uncomfortable. Previous review, the British forced Denmark to sell their colonies in India, and France temporarily intervened. In the end, the British were in vain. Not only did they become enemies with Denmark, but their colonies were also divided among Austria, France, and the Netherlands, giving themselves to competitors in India. Among them, Austria got Tranquebar, France got Serampore, and the Dutch got the Nicobar Islands. But now France is not in the mood to pay much attention to the affairs of the Indian subcontinent. There are still a lot of bigger troubles after the Swiss Civil War, and the Year of Storm is approaching step by step. He didn't want Queen Zangsi, who would stir up troubles in the Indian subcontinent in the future, to die in the turmoil of the Austrian Empire. As for people like Dani, it would be fine, as long as they maintained the interest relationship, and there was no need to invest too much emotional chips. Treating the latter too well will only cause them to have unnecessary fantasies. France is not here to help the poor Lakshmi Pai bow to Franz with her palms clasped together. You are love, abundance and auspiciousness. I'm also love, auspiciousness and abundance. Franz hated this kind of religious ceremony and just waved his hands as a farewell. Little Maria on the side was very sad. After all, she didn't have many friends, and even fewer silly friends could make trouble like this. I won't write about the farewell of the two girls. In short, Franz took his sister away, and Lakshmi Pai also returned to India, and walked towards her destiny. However, the difference this time was that she was not forced to have no choice, but to actively embrace her destiny. 3 days later, the Prime Minister's office. Metternich understood what Franz meant, but his appetite was a bit big. But he finally understood why those southern German monarchs had to participate. 1 day later, Metternich summoned Baron Pasquier. The latter was worried because the information the former gave him was true and had been confirmed by his own intelligence. However, France's domestic attitude towards the Swiss issue remains tough, and the military does not accept Austria's further expansion of its territory. King Louis Philippe even secretly hinted that if France cannot get land that satisfies itself, then no one can get it. In fact, after coming to Vienna, Baron Pasquier discovered the amazing changes in the city. Although the streets of Paris have undergone great changes in the past 10 years, they have not reached the level of changing the world. Vienna has almost doubled in size, and almost all of it has been replaced except for the ancient buildings in the city center. Only a small section of Vienna's city wall remains as a memorial, and the rest was torn down and rebuilt. The exaggerated glass windows on the street are almost unbelievable. And the prices are even more incredible. The price of the same piece of display glass in Austria is only 1/20th of that in France. It is no wonder that almost all shops in Vienna can afford it, while in Paris only the most luxurious places use such huge glass. Those department store buildings were even more exaggerated. Such a huge 4-story building, no matter how he jumped, and rolled, it didn't shake at all. The railways along the way are even more exaggerated. In France it is common for people to chase trains on foot, but in Austria this is almost impossible. Not to mention the road protection teams patrolling back and forth. Even if ordinary people chase them, they can only be helpless when faced with a train traveling at a speed of 50 to 60 km per hour. Baron Pasquier specializes in espionage work. According to his experience, there must be a more powerful violent organization behind such prosperity to maintain it. Therefore, Baron Pasquier now doubts whether France and Austria are still on the same starting line, and whether he still has a chance to negotiate fairly. Baron Pasquier, please take a seat. Thank you, Prime Minister. After a brief exchange of greetings, the main reason I invite you here this time is to convey our country's intentions to your country. The Free State of Switzerland has affected the peace of Europe, and we, the big countries, should shoulder the responsibilities of big countries. We should eliminate this hazard permanently. Chapter 805 Appetite. Eliminate future troubles forever. Baron Pasquier couldn't help but swallowed, showing a nervous and greedy look. This undoubtedly means that the Austrian side is about to take action, which means that the two parties will finally start negotiating prices. Metternich looked at Baron Pasquier, who couldn't handle his expression well the first time, and couldn't help but sigh. It's still too young. What we mean is that we can destroy once and for all the free states that started the war, and then place them under our supervision and educate their people. Prince Metternich was very professional in this regard. In short, France and Austria had to liquidate the evil heretics who initiated the war for self-defense, and for the sake of peace in Europe. Anyway, he picked himself clean, and Metternich was very eloquent. When he listened to it, Baron Pasquier was also very excited, as if he was going to save the world. But a deal is a deal, and Baron Pasquier knew this very well, and he quickly got out of his emotions, because Metternich's long speech only talked about the free states, but did not talk about the treatment plan for the Orthodox states. It was impossible to miss such an important matter, but it was also impossible for Baron Pasquier to refrain from asking, "Your Excellency, those guys under the banner of freedom are indeed annoying. But I think the people of the Orthodox state are also very pitiful, and they also need our two countries to work together to protect and resettle them. But they are not at fault, and the Swiss Orthodoxy is our ally. Not only can we and the Austrian Empire not attack our allies, but we will also resolutely attack those evil forces that threaten our allies' way of survival." Baron Pasquier felt that this was almost the bottom line of the Austrian Empire, but just carving up the free states could not satisfy Louis Philippe's appetite. Baron Pasquier knew this very well, although he felt that it would be a good result if France and Austria could equally divide the free state at this time. But as a close minister of Louis Philippe, Baron Pasquier is not qualified to decide anything for the king. He is just a ruthless work machine. He must accurately convey the king's meaning and take the blame at critical moments. Otherwise he has no value. Your Excellency, I think we should consider bringing the entire Switzerland under the protection of our two countries, taking into account the emotional factors between your country and the Orthodox alliance. We in France are willing to transfer 2 states and at the same time sponsor you with 5 million francs to rebuild the manor. Prince Metternich actually didn't want to continue talking nonsense with this little guy, but he was still moved by his professionalism. First of all, Baron Pasquier, I admire your professionalism, but allies are allies, not for emotional reasons. Secondly, you are not qualified to discuss this matter. The Congress of Vienna will be held as scheduled, and most monarchies, including us in Austria, will participate. Finally, I wish you a happy stay in Vienna. Baron Pasquier heard some meaning in these misty words. That is, he was not qualified to be on the chessboard, because Austria did not want to talk about a secret treaty, but wanted to hold a European monarchs conference to resolve the matter. But this is disgusting, because the region with the most monarchs in Europe is Germany. No, probably the most in the world if the Austrian Empire insists on holding a vote, then France will focus on it. Secondly, Austria wanted an official French embassy, and preferably the monarch himself. In the end, all his actions were actually under the surveillance of the Austrians. This is not surprising to Baron Pasquier. As a butler who specializes in serving the king, he has a very keen sense of smell in this regard. At this time, the words had been spoken, and Baron Pasquier breathed a sigh of relief. At least he no longer had to take the blame. However, his master's character might lose his temper and do something that was not in the interest of France. Thank you for talking to me so much. I will truthfully convey to the country what you know the Austrian Empire means. This time Metternich nodded. Receiving foreign heads of state is a very troublesome thing, especially when hosting dozens of them at one time. Some German monarchs who are too busy or too bored to stay in their own country have arrived in Vienna in advance to start dancing and shopping mode. Fortunately, Vienna has been expanded many times, otherwise it would not be able to withstand such trouble. But Franz also saw what it means to be shameless. These people relied on their status as monarchs to show off in various ways at the dance. He even suspected that these people had no food to eat in China. They could eat several pigs in one meal, and they also accepted all kinds of snacks. The ostentation of the monarchs of small countries is usually not great, and they may not be able to enjoy it as well as wealthy businessmen and bankers. For example, the Grand Duke of Liechtenstein brought 7 people with him, including bodyguards and servants, which was not as grand as Solomon Rothschild's butler. But don't underestimate these 7 people. They can eat 15 kilograms of meat, an equal amount of vegetables, 35 liters of beer and an unknown number of desserts every day. This is almost as good as the food broadcasting of later generations. The monarch of Vienna had went so far as to bring more than 100 relatives and friends to build up his momentum. In addition to the ministers, servants, and guards, there were more than 300 people. Among the 3 South German countries, only Ludwig I of Bavaria did not come. He was Mrs. Sophie's brother, but the relationship between the two was not good. According to Mrs. Sophie, Ludwig I was the result of her parents' shortcomings, including coquettishness, arrogance, stupidity, laziness, and overflowing compassion. However, I have to say that Mrs. Sophie's evaluation is quite accurate. Franz often heard tidbits about this uncle even in Vienna. Especially the rumors about the French dancer Lullymunster have been written into pamphlets and spread everywhere. In fact, only 3 countries in Germany have not responded directly to Austria so far, namely Prussia, Hanover, and Bavaria. In fact, the reason why various countries responded so positively is that the Austrian Empire itself was powerful enough to deter most countries. Secondly, there is the influence of the German customs union, and the connections across Germany are constantly deepening. Finally, the German Confederation led by Austria had achieved too many previous victories, and coupled with the improvement of people's lives, the German national ideology was much more turbulent than in history. The German nationalists have been strengthened to the epic level. They can already kidnap the monarchs of some small countries and even influence the national policies of medium-sized countries. The Danish monarch, for example, was forced to attend the Congress of Vienna because German Confederation officials deliberately sent invitations to Schleswig-Holstein. It was impossible for Christian VIII to let the local Germans choose their own representatives. Denmark proposed suppression. After thinking about France, which had been beaten twice, and King Leopold I of Belgium, who had visited some time ago, he gave up this idea. The Germans are crazy, we are not crazy, so we cannot be on the same page with them. Chapter 806. Undercurrent is surging. The surging public opinion even affected powerful states such as Prussia, Hanover, and Bavaria to a certain extent. In fact, even empires like Austria had been kidnapped by it before, but Prussia's problems were actually mainly caused by Franz. Franz has been supporting the Archbishop of Cologne. His original purpose was to give Prussia a taste of what dualism is. Note, in this era, the Rhineland was not bordering the mainland of the Kingdom of Prussia, and most of it was the spoils of the Napoleonic Wars. At the same time, the people in the region mainly believe in Catholicism, and the King of Prussia is a Protestant. The Archbishop of Cologne has been quarreling with the Hohenzollern family on this matter for decades. However, there is really no good solution for the latter, because except for some Prussian nobles like Krupp, other people in the local area don't care at all. So Bavaria has always been eyeing the Rhineland point. When Franz funded the Archbishop of Cologne, he also wanted him to cause trouble for Prussia. However, the Archbishop skillfully combined religion and nationalism. Now there is a problem. Usually nationalists are suppressed by their own country, but Prussia's power in the Rhine region cannot form a crushing advantage over the Archbishop of Cologne, and can only seek compromise. Austria is absolutely impossible to do this on Prussian territory. Kind of a thing. Putting aside whether Prussia is willing or not, Austria cannot bear the international influence alone. The latter will become the leader of the reaction at worst, and will be surrounded at worst. As a result, the Archbishop of Cologne had no one to rule in the Rhineland, and he acted like a leader of the German nation. In addition, he was a missionary himself, and he had great agitation capabilities. But fortunately, the Archbishop is a big Germanist and still openly supports Austria. But under the temptation of monstrous power and the pressure of nearly tsunami-like public opinion, it is uncertain how long the Archbishop can maintain his true intentions. In fact, the area where German nationalism was most serious was not Cologne, but Bohemia in the Austrian Empire. Unlike the Archbishop of Cologne's empty target shooting, Bohemia had already made enemy, the Czech nationalists. After so many years of development, the local German immigrant population has exceeded the local Czech population. Bohemia was originally the industrial center of Austria, and at this time it became the foreign trade center within the German Confederation. Coupled with the support of Franz's various technologies and policies, the local economy took off directly. But it also further intensified the contradiction between outsiders, Germans, and locals. Czech nationalists. Note, Czech nationalists are not necessarily Czechs. Czech nationalism was originally invented by local German nobles to fight against the Austrian central government. But there are some lies that you start to believe if you tell them enough. In short, German nationalists and Czech nationalists faced off in Bohemia, Austria. Czech nationalists say this is their territory, while German nationalists feel that this is Austrian territory, and the Austrian Empire is the chairman of the German Confederation, so this is also German territory. The Czechs began to open the book, saying that it was the Czechs who established the kingdom in Bohemia first, and that the Austrian Habsburg family was the thief. German nationalists also read the book and said that the Czechs were outsiders who migrated from the east and expelled the local Germans. Austria's return of Bohemia was the restoration of Bohemia. There are often heated debates and fights between the two sides, which may seem like a flood, but may actually be a tsunami. In addition, the Netherlands and Luxembourg are also the areas hardest hit by German nationalism. King William II of the Netherlands was not a very talented king. He wanted to continue his father's reforms, but he did not have enough courage, so he began to compete with the people for profit. The Netherlands has the highest tax rate in Germany, which has led to the Dutch economy not taking off as expected. After joining Germany, Wilhelm II decided to do it himself, but he also liked nepotism, which led to rampant corruption. At the same time, his religious and ethnic policies have also been criticized, and his control of overseas affairs is even worse. King William II of the Netherlands was afraid that the Netherlands would be assimilated by Germany, so he forced Calvinism. His original purpose was to separate from Lutheranism in North Germany. But the result is that it has seriously harmed some citizens, and at the same time, this kind of religious hegemony is also very hateful. Note, Calvinism and Lutheranism have had significant differences in the past. As the earliest region in Europe to develop capitalism, people have taken things like religion and ethnicity very lightly, but this does not mean that they like to accept things as they come. Nationally, he did not recognize the Dutch as Germans. William II also showed off his Anglo-Saxon ancestry all day long, often talking about his glorious deeds of serving the British Army with the Duke of Wellington. If this were more than 10 years ago, the Dutch would have admired him, but now they would only feel disgusted. The loose German Confederation on one side and the highly exploitative and oppressive Dutch government on the other caused some Dutch people to feel that they were not Dutch, while others felt that being German had more advantages than being Dutch. At first it was just complaints and jokes from some people, but with the advent of nationalism and the participation of a large number of speculators, conflicts within the Netherlands rapidly escalated. As a result, Caroline, a spy, had to often come forward to help stabilize the situation, but William II only felt that this was just a pain of reform. Luxembourg has embarked on a road of national fanaticism since the old Calder carried gold in a coffin to Frankfurt. First, the German Confederation responded to the request of the Luxembourgers, defeating the Belgians and French on their doorstep, while excluding the Dutch. The three mountains that were weighing on the Luxembourgers were directly removed, and the resumption of their homeland doubled the population of Luxembourg and quadrupled the land. How could the Luxembourgers not be fanatical? After the war, a sea of construction aid materials from the German Confederation filled every warehouse in Luxembourg. In fact, this was also a means for various states to win over them, but it was completely different from the perspective of Luxembourgers. Luxembourg's economic growth has been above 40% every year since then, which is a game-changing change for the already wealthy Luxembourgers, and for those West Luxembourgers and Limburgers who have been poor for generations or even dozens of generations. It is an unimaginable happiness. The highly transparent and almost universal participation in politics and the almost fanatical national sentiment make it difficult for corruption to flourish, allowing the poor relatives of the Luxembourgers to truly become serfs and sink. As a result, during the Alsace-Lorraine crisis, businessmen, workers, and students across Luxembourg went on strike, and government members took the lead in joining the army. A country with a population of 1 million managed to gather 100,000 troops and 100,000 civilians. It was the country in the German Confederation that sent the most troops besides Austria and Prussia. Chapter 807 Shields First Pot of Gold. Nationalism can send those German monarchs over, but whether they are willing to contribute depends on Franz's ability. Canton of Lucerne, Switzerland. Doofus troops were replenished and reached 130,000 people. At the same time, he heard good news that the Orthodox Alliance had disbanded tens of thousands of troops for unknown reasons according to the intelligence coming from Lucerne and other places. Doofer estimated that the total strength of the Orthodox Alliance should be between 60,000 and 70,000, so now there should be less than 50,000. The Orthodox Alliance's disbandment of troops also revealed the message that their material reserves were insufficient. In addition, although the Orthodox Alliance opened up channels to Ticino state, reinforcement from the Kingdom of Sardinia and Austria did not arrive, and the volunteers promoted by the French seemed to have stopped taking action after conquering Ticino state. There is also good news. That is, the surface of the Reuss River has been completely frozen, and soldiers and war horses can pass on it. He can finally launch a full-scale attack. The same news looks like a disaster for the Orthodox Alliance. Why are there so many people? Marshal Ulrich Salis couldn't believe the information, and then turned to the state representative who strongly advocated the disbandment of the new recruits. Sigwart, look at the good thing you have done. The opponent's main attack force is more than 3 times ours, and there are more than 40,000 people in Zug. How can we win this war? Constantin Sigwart was also wronged. There had been no large-scale fighting for several weeks, and there were tens of thousands of mouths to eat. Moreover, Archduke Karol either trained those new soldiers, or used them as civilian laborers. It seemed that they were not needed on the front line. Instead of using those recruits as combatants, it is better to use them as logistics. As for the extra people, they can return to their place of origin and let them pay more taxes and use taxes in lieu of labor. 60,000 people. That's 60,000 mouths. They are not needed on the battlefield. Do you know how much money has been spent since the war started? Ulrich Salis asked indifferently. How do I know? At worst, if everyone in Switzerland donates 1 franc, wouldn't the problem be solved? Constantin Sigwart was speechless for a moment. This was not because he could not refute the former's words, but because as a professional, this sentence was full of flaws and he didn't know where to start. 1 million francs as a personal property is undoubtedly very amazing in this era, but when it comes to the country, it seems a bit insignificant. In fact, Constantine Sigvort had not said a word before Carlo Alberto gave him a bribe of 10 million lire. At that time, the coinage technology of the Kingdom of Sardinia was very poor, and its actual circulation range was not large, especially after Austria formed the Apennine Commercial League, which was equivalent to 7.5 million francs. However, the money did not reach the hands of the former, because Ticino state suddenly rebelled, but Constantine Sigvort never dared to say anything about it. In fact, he didn't know whether he really had the money, and Carlo Alberto also didn't dare to make too much noise, because if this transaction was exposed, it would definitely cause dissatisfaction and even hostility from the Austrian side. As a small country sandwiched between two powerful powers, the monarchs in the history of the Kingdom of Sardinia all lacked the wisdom to survive, so they could only break their teeth and swallow blood. Closer to home, Constantine Sigvort and Ulrich Salis were at loggerheads, and they soon moved from war and political affairs to personal attacks. Sigvort, don't think I don't know. Since you became a state representative, not to mention your relatives and friends, even your neighbors' children have become officials. The fact that money is spent so quickly must have something to do with you. Ulrich Salis was the first to break the news, and Constantine Sigvort was not to be outdone. What? About you? Marshal Salis? How many generals in the army are your students and colleagues now? The two sides went back and forth for a while, and Archduke Karol had no choice but to come out to help smooth things over. The current military strength is sufficient to defend against external enemies, but strong fortresses are often breached from within. We must unite and resist the invasion of the Free States, for the sake of the Orthodox Union. 4. The Orthodox Alliance. Slogans always make people feel uplifting, but Archduke Karol is a little helpless. It is difficult for him to imagine that the top leaders of a country are actually such people. Afterwards, Archduke Karol gave a few special instructions. The battle can be left to the soldiers on the front line, but the supplies must be kept up, and the soldiers who were killed or injured must also be provided with pensions. Otherwise, if there is a problem inside the fortress, it will not be possible for him as a warrior. Solved. Constantine Sigvort and Ulrich Salis still admired the military god of the Austrian Empire very much. Not only did he lead the Orthodox Alliance to a series of victories, but more importantly, Austria's attitude after the victory in the war will greatly affect the affiliation of the new Prime Minister of the Swiss Confederation. At least they thought so. Archduke Karol felt very tired, because he had a premonition that something bad might happen. Before the second round of confrontation between Archduke Karol and General Duffer began, there was still a small episode. Charles Duchat's army invaded Ticino state almost effortless. The so-called tens of thousands of troops were distributed in more than a dozen fortresses of various sizes. These defenders were not interested in war and were unprepared, and the news was horribly blocked. The French army quickly captured several occupation notes, but at this time Charles Duchat discovered a problem. That is, the defenders of Ticino state still stood still. He brought more than 1,000 people with him to Switzerland this time, and it was impossible to occupy the territory he had conquered. But this is not a problem for the French army, which has been fighting all year round. According to past practice, they rob, burn, and kill what they can. Seeing how ferocious the French army was, the Swiss handed over a lot of important information in order to survive. Charles Duchat finally understood why Ticino state's troops were concentrated in several fortresses in remote locations before the war started. The Kingdom of Sardinia had sent a batch of supplies to the Orthodox Alliance. This batch of supplies included weapons and equipment for 5,000 people, 100 carts of food, and 10 million lire. At that time, Ticino state was preparing to rebel, so the money, goods, and weapons were naturally withheld. For 10 million lire, several battles took place among the top officials of Ticino state. In the end, the governor of the state won. He was afraid that others would get access to the money, so he concentrated heavy troops in his hometown to guard it at all times. That's why Ticino state's defense was so poor. But the officer who told the secret did not survive, and the governor and the currency he cherished all became spoils of war for the French. Charles Duchat had been involved in French military affairs for several years. He knew that power was money, and that money could be turned into power, and the 10 million lire in front of him can help him climb to a high position that is impossible to climb in his life. The parents and villagers of Lyon are still waiting for him. Chapter 808 Back to the starting point. As a result, Charles Dutch had received his first angel investment, and Ticino state also suffered unprecedented catastrophe. In fact, there is another reason why Charles Dutch had occupied Ticino Canton, and did not move. That is that he did not wait for Louis Philippe's order. In the eyes of the latter, the volunteer plan had already failed, and the former had long been forgotten by him. At this time, Louis Philippe was considering whether to go to Vienna in person. In fact, France and Austria have the same interests, and carving up Switzerland should be beneficial to both countries. However, the monarch's personal attendance still gave Austria too much face. But Louis Philippe thought about it again. If he didn't give this face, would the other party really let Switzerland maintain the status quo? After all, the channel to Ticino has been opened, but the Austrian side still hasn't made any move. Could it be that Austria has reached some kind of agreement with the Orthodox Union in Switzerland? Will a pro-Austrian government be established? The more Louis Philippe thought about it, the more afraid he became, so he decided to go to Vienna. He must have given face to him, so that the other party would not embarrass him. Switzerland. On the banks of the Reuss River, Dufour once again cheered up and gave an exciting speech. He really wanted to maintain peace in the country of peace, but the development of the war had exceeded the scope of his control. Dufour really wanted to end this meaningless war, and the officers in the audience were very excited when they heard this, but the soldiers had no desire to go to the battlefield and die. Although the ice was frozen solid, there was no problem with the men and horses, and they couldn't break it even with a hammer. But who knows what will happen if the cannonball hits it? The soldiers looked anxiously at the frozen river in front of them, and no one was willing to take the first step. But it was not up to them. The drum sounded, the officers raised their whips, and the soldiers were driven forward like mules and horses. The Orthodox Alliance soldiers on the other side also didn't want to fight, but they couldn't help but think more when the troops were approaching the city. The artillery's long-distance shooting is obviously not the protagonist of the battlefield. The soldiers from Freiburg were summoned again, and they will be the first batch of cannon fodder to step into this land of death. When the attacking Free State troops were a third of the way forward, Orthodox Union artillery began raining down on the ice. Sure enough, the ice was fragile under the bombardment of artillery shells. As a result, the surrender troops on the ice were embarrassed. There were enemy troops in front and a supervisory team behind them, and the ice under their feet could collapse at any time. In this situation, the first reaction of the people would definitely be to run back. However, the supervising team at the rear seemed determined to kill them. They actually brought in cannons loaded with shotgun shells. The damage caused by shotgun shells to infantry at close range is very terrifying. Going back will lead to a dead end. So what about going forward? Some people thought they were soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance, so they ran back while yelling, hoping that someone would recognize them. One of our own. Don't shoot. But the battlefield was chaotic, with the roar of artillery, the roar of officers, the roar of soldiers, and the voices of those surrendering troops were quickly drowned out. Seeing the enemy troops rushing towards them, the soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance began to fight back, driven by their survival instinct. It was almost impossible to reach the other side alive. What about staying where you are? Waiting to die is naturally a matter of seeking benevolence and gaining benevolence. No matter forward or backward, some people were lucky enough to survive, but all those who were waiting to die were buried here. Just as Ulrich Salas was celebrating another great victory on the front line, unfortunate news came that a Free Alliance force had successfully crossed the river from the flank. In fact, the soldiers who surrendered from Freiburg were cannon fodder. They made a strong attack on the front, and Dufour used this opportunity to deliver one of his elite troops to the other side of the river. This mistake was caused by many factors. First of all, Dufour's vigorous attack on the front attracted too much attention from the Orthodox Alliance, and many troops were temporarily transferred to the bridgehead. As a result, the defense force along the river was empty. At the same time, the previous observation hot air balloon was so useful that everyone had a kind of magical confidence in it. As a result, due to the cold and strong winds that day, the hot air balloon could not take off, and the Orthodox Alliance was directly blind. At this time, the Orthodox Alliance can choose to counterattack with all its strength and drive the enemy back. But this was Very risky, and Archduke Charles did not agree with this approach, because the encounter in the wild was exactly what Dufa wanted. The Free States troops had an absolute advantage at this time, and this kind of bloody battle with fists and fists was exactly what they wanted. Apart from his own guards and Austria's elite veterans, Archduke Karol had no troops that could give him an advantage in the encounter. There are only more than 3,000 of these people left, and he simply cannot withstand the consumption. As for the soldiers of the Orthodox Alliance, again, they can defend the city, but forget about engaging in encounters on the surface. Dufa seemed to have finally won a move, but in fact the two sides were still at the starting point. After that, he used those surrendered troops to add several trenches, but the troops with low morale, lack of heavy weapons, and no experience in sieging cities could not get any advantage in front of modern defense master. There was no suspense in the several battles, and even the outermost bastion was not conquered by the descending troops. But Dufa was not anxious at all, because it was useless to rush. Unless he could make a detour, he would have to go through bastions one by one. This was determined by the terrain, and there was nothing he could do about it. In this era, it was normal for a siege to last for half a year, let alone such a fortress with natural dangers. However, he could wait, but Joseph Loy at the rear could not wait. Because every day that goes by in the war increases the likelihood that France and Austria will intervene. Joseph Loy has always been very confident in the Swiss Confederation, but no matter how confident he is, he does not think that Switzerland can withstand the attack of the two major powers. What's more, Switzerland's enemies may not be limited to France and Austria. On the other hand, the British promised only half of the fulfillment. The latter did lodge a solemn protest to France and Austria, but took no next step. The supplies of nearly 200,000 troops were too heavy for the Swiss Confederation. What's even more frightening is that as the war continues to lengthen, governors everywhere begin to enjoy the feeling of having great power. These people use war to create clever pretexts, plunder and eradicate dissidents, just like warlords. There were already suggestions within the Liberal Alliance to adopt a confederal system, because it would be more liberal. However, this ran counter to the ideals of Joseph Loy, who wanted a strong and unified Swiss confederation, rather than a return to the original confederation. So Joseph Loy began to inject chicken blood into his generals, promising high officials, generous salaries, and a beautiful reputation. As the saying goes, there must be a brave man under a heavy reward, but there is also a saying that the young and the dangerous will always be a clean if they don't use their brains. A young Free State general decided to attack the Gotthard Pass, but was ambushed by Heinrich Irebum in the valley. He lost more than 3,000 people and even failed to touch the wall of the Gotthard fortress. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 809, The Intruding Earl of Chambord. The battle situation in Zug State is also not optimistic. Ever since Augustin Keller underestimated the enemy and rushed in and destroyed the main force of the Second Army, the Orthodox Alliance's counterattacks have not stopped. At the same time, in order to maintain huge military expenditures and to appease the Free State allies, Joseph Loy imposed a series of economic sanctions on Fribourg and Zug. However, the reality is that even if the tax revenue of these two states is fully increased, not much oil and water can be squeezed out. Later, a series of compensation agreements and military recruitment plans were introduced, but the entire situation continued to deteriorate. So Joseph Loy had to consider more radical methods. The final winner of the Swiss Confederation in history was not a mediocre person. He knew what could be touched and what could not be touched. Civilians themselves have no money, not to mention that they have sent their children, husbands, and fathers to the battlefield. As for the official, he cannot be touched either, because he still relies on these people to maintain order. The Jesuits, the monasteries, the clergy, they were a good place to start. After all, if no one can survive, who will speak for God? Joseph ordered all monasteries to be inspected, their property confiscated, and all priests and nuns sent to frontline military camps. All Jesuit property was also subject to confiscation, and those who had supported the Jesuits were required to donate double their funds to the federal government, otherwise they would be treated as enemies. A large number of historic monasteries were burned to the ground, and many precious books, materials, and sacred relics were lost. But even so, his funds still appear to be insufficient. Switzerland is not rich in products, and many things need to be imported from abroad, and these powerful neighbors happen to be on the side of the Orthodox alliance. Since the beginning of the war, France, Sardinia, Austria, and the entire German Confederation have imposed an embargo on the Swiss Free State, which has led to an increase in the prices of many materials, and the prices of the most important strategic materials. Gunpowder and saltpeter have increased 20-fold. The most destructive thing is that the main salt mines in Switzerland are all in the areas ruled by the Orthodox Alliance. The largest salt mine in the Free State, Bex, was attacked by several fanatics after the collapse of a maze-like underground salt cavern thousands of meters deep underground. It would be impossible to resume production within a month or two in an era without large-scale excavation equipment. What's even more unfortunate is that good things can spread thousands of miles without leaving home, and the news of the bombing of the Free State salt mine spread throughout Switzerland in a very short period of time. As a result, the salt grabbing incident took place in Switzerland in the 19th century. As for how crazy people were for salt at that time, I will not describe it. This led to a series of chain reactions, and daily necessities began to rise crazily, among which the price of sugar increased 50-fold. In fact, although Austria and France have announced embargoes, businessmen with official backgrounds have never stopped trading with Switzerland. It's just that prices have risen very ridiculously. And only the Kingdom of Sardinia is really implementing a complete embargo, because Carlo Alberto really wants a new territory. In addition, consumption is also a big problem. Friulosa's army only eats 10 meals a day for each soldier, and it cannot use 3,000 tons of food in a month. However, at this time, the North had to face the threats from the southern German countries, and had to clean up the internal resistance forces. Actually Tanner Amidst's guerrillas, so Joseph could only turn a blind eye. One eye. Dufa gathered his main force in Lucerne, but was blocked by the fortress in the valley. After several battles, the Free State lost troops and generals, but the front line did not advance a single point. The Swiss Confederation's army is ridiculously monotonous, but Dufa can't really be blamed for this. In fact, since the French Revolution, the army has rarely occupied bastions. Napoleon, the god of war of that era, also used high-speed maneuvers to deal with bastions, bypassing the bastions and striking the enemy's rear. But how do you want to get around the Swiss mountains? Given the organization level of the troops in this era, if 100,000 troops marched into the mountains and half of them came out, they would be considered strong troops. But in fact, considering factors such as supplies, it is impossible to imitate Hannibal and climb the mountain. What about soil work? In winter, the surface of the ground is so frozen that dogs can't dig it. After finally digging through the hard surface, we found that the groundwater level here is quite high due to the influence of the Rias River. If construction is forced, there will be a high probability of collapse. But this was the best way Dufa could think of at this time, which was to approach the bastion by constantly digging trenches. In the meantime, he also tried to use a powerful weapon such as the Congreve rocket. However, this weapon was very limited in its power against sand and gravel buildings. After firing hundreds of rounds, he gave up after finding that it had no obvious effect. As time went by, both sides of the civil war gradually became tired, but the off-field became lively. The British flourished on both sides of the border. On the one hand, they continued to expand their interests in the east. On the other hand, they firmly rejected US President Polk's request to redraw the US-Canada border on the American continent. On the European continent, the French Bourbon Orthodox Henry V announced his participation in the Congress of Vienna with a high profile, but the title he used to attend the Congress of Vienna was Count of Chambord. The Earl of Chambord was actually supported by the French Orthodox faction. Since Louis XIX had no heirs, He became the legal heir to the Bourbon throne at this time point. In fact, the Count of Chambord only had one Chambord castle in France at this time, which seemed not worth mentioning compared to Louis Philippe, who owned the whole of France. However, Count Chambord made a surprising decision in November 1846, that is, to marry the Archduchess Maria the son of Austria. This kind of repeated jump operation is not uncommon in the history of the Bourbon family. However, everyone has to admit that he has attracted strong support from the Austrian Empire, which makes the balance of victory and defeat tremble again. You must know that the neighborly relations between France and Austria at this time cannot be called harmonious. Louis Philippe has fought twice with the Austrian Empire either actively or passively. Austria had every reason to put the more pro-Austrian Earl of Chambord on the French throne, and the British also wanted to use him to stop the Orleans dynasty's ambitions in Spain. As soon as this news came out, the French Orthodox faction celebrated, while the Bonapartists expressed strong indignation. On the contrary, the Orleans faction chose to lie down. In fact, the reason is very simple. The Orleans faction has money and industry. As long as the monarch wants to stabilize the country, he cannot do without them. Moreover, over the years, they have clearly known that Louis Philippe is not a good king. The Bonapartists were completely different. Although they were not weak in France at this time, the army was the most vulnerable place to be purged. It is true that Louis Philippe was a loser, but he still had hope of restoration among the Bonapartists. If a pro-Austrian king came to power, there would be no way for this group of people to survive, so they behaved particularly fiercely. Louis Philippe himself was even more numb. He really didn't expect that a Count of Chambord would come out. Chapter 810 Chaos. What are the Austrians going to do? Do they want to make that guy Chambord the king of France? Even if he signs, I will never agree. The staff on the side were all shocked by the monarch's impressive IQ. France was not a small country like Germany. Austria was abolished at any time and stood up at any time. However, no one dared to remind Louis Philippe of overthinking, because this lord liked to be suspicious. But because of this, the staff did not want to lose their future, so they all looked at the royal butler, Baron Pasquier. The latter was a little helpless, but he had already prepared to take the blame and said, "Your Majesty, this should be a trick played by the Austrians. They just want to force you to go to Vienna. It seems that they are in trouble. Otherwise, there would be no need to use this method. But what if it's not? What if this is Chambord's trick? Then, you should go to Vienna, so that you cannot offend Austria and ruin Chambord's conspiracy. France has but one king, and that is you." Baron Pasquier then slapped him with the flattery. After all, he couldn't reach out and hit the smiling man. However, Louis Philippe's expression was extremely serious at this time, and he said, "There is only one king of France, and that's me, and I don't need anyone to prove it." The staff were a little confused. They didn't understand why Louis Philippe wanted to offend Austria at this critical juncture. You must know that there will be a marriage between the Orleans dynasty and the Spanish Bourbons next, and the neighbor Austria next door will definitely affect the success or failure of this matter to a great extent. Even if it is not for the future, if you want to get Swiss territory now, you must have a good relationship with Austria. However, a considerable part of the staff did not want Louis Philippe and Austria to divide Switzerland equally, because that would lead to direct bordering between the two countries, and the conflict between the two sides would then escalate further. In fact, there is no shortage of smart people in any country, but whether these people have the opportunity to climb to high positions, whether they have the opportunity to speak, and whether their words can be adopted, is another matter. The same news became a big deal when it arrived in the Kingdom of Sardinia. Carlo Alberto found it very interesting that the Habsburg family would cause a lot of trouble every time they married a daughter. There is no way. Who knows that Austria's past exploits in bed have become deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Would the Austrians want to put the Count of Chambord on the French throne and then wait until he dies to unite France? Carlo Alberto laughed when he thought of this. After all, this kind of thing is too absurd and bizarre. Soon he was brought back to reality by how to expand the territory. The military power and influence of the Kingdom of Sardinia were simply incomparable to Austria. But it seems that his son has also married a princess from the Habsburg family, or he can play the love card. So Vittorio, the crown prince of the Kingdom of Sardinia, and his wife set out for Vienna. The Count of Chambord wanted to attend the Congress of Vienna as the owner of Chambord Castle, which aroused a series of speculations in Germany. The mainstream view is that this is a signal that Austria intends to intervene in French affairs. After all, this kind of thing has happened frequently in history. However, the Austrian diplomatic system was in chaos at this time. Although they had long known that Count Chambord had arrived in Vienna, it was normal for young nobles to wander around, especially after he married an Egyptian. After the Grand Duchess of the Ste family, everything fell into place. However, the news that Count Chambord announced that he would participate in the Congress of Vienna was announced in Paris, so the Austrian side was the last to know the news. Although the Austrian diplomacy and intelligence services were at loggerheads, Prince Metternich, the person at the helm, was quite happy. Because the addition of Count Chambord was equivalent to breaking the situation between France and Austria. Louis Philippe did not have many choices in this case. Of course, if the latter really doesn't come, then the Austrian Empire will have a lot of room for maneuver. Let's not talk about the future. At present, Archduke Franz is a poster directly bordering France, so it is completely possible to give the French-speaking states close to France to this landless king. Manipulating elections is not difficult for the Austrian Empire at all. With the Count of Chambord as a barrier, Austria can take over the remaining land. Of course, the specific operation cannot be so direct. You must control part of it and puppet another part. In addition, if France takes a tough stance, it can consider giving up areas such as Geneva and Vaud, and giving Bern to Count Chambord as a buffer zone between France and Austria. However, Baron Pasquier soon brought the unfortunate news that King Louis Philippe and his family were unable to attend the appointment because of the cold. This result made Metternich somewhat unacceptable. Although his tone and expression were still casual, his heart was already in a state of confusion. Mr. Pasquier, I have something I would like you to convey to me. Okay, please speak. Baron Pasquier was also helpless. He really wanted to facilitate this trip, but he was also helpless when meeting a monarch like Louis Philippe. Which country is most willing to see the decline of Austria and France? Back then, we designated Switzerland as a permanent neutral country, because we did not want any more wars. Distance creates beauty. The farther away we are, the safer Europe will be. Do you understand what I mean? Baron Pasquier nodded. He knew very well what Metternich meant. In fact, many people in France felt that the Swiss Civil War was too strange, and the British actions were abnormal. No wonder Austria opposed the partition of Switzerland. It turned out that the problem was not a question of strength or interest at all, but that Austria discovered the sinister intentions of the British and wanted to avoid more serious consequences. Thank you, Your Excellency, Prince. I will tell you the truth. Baron Pasquier quickly left Vienna and returned to Paris. In fact, he still had a lot to say, but now it seems that the words Louis Philippe said were stupid and arrogant. Only a core member like him is aware of France's current internal and external troubles. The foundation of the externally powerful Orleans dynasty has been loosened. The people who had supported it had reached an almost intolerable level, and the nobility and bourgeoisie were ready to seize power at any time. And now there was also the Count of Chambord, a pretender to the throne. There are banquets held almost every week in Paris, and those glamorous guys have already begun plotting how to seize power. Baron Pasquier reminded Louis Philippe more than once that he should take some tough measures, but the latter repeatedly refused. Maybe he cherished his reputation, maybe he didn't want to take risks, but he didn't know why, except himself. The British did not react much to the news that Count Chambord had attended the Congress of Vienna. After all, the more chaotic the European continent, the better. Franz had no reaction to this, because it was all planned by him, but Louis Philippe's approach made him a little surprised. Chapter 811 Destiny and Miracles. The Earl of Chambord was once the child who saved the Bourbon dynasty. Both the Bourbons and Habsburgs in the 19th century faced the same problem, that is, the issue of success, as the Bourbon dynasty was almost extinct before the Earl of Chambord was born. Louis Philippe actually belonged to the Orleans dynasty, and the main Habsburg branches in Austria were similar during the same period. Fortunately, Mrs. Sophie was able to survive. Chambord's uncle Louis XIX called him the son of miracles, and the Orthodox royalists like to call him Leonard by his last name, which means miracle. People have high expectations for him, hoping that he can restore the glory of Bourbon. Historically, he has been evaluated as French Washington, the savior of French democracy, and the founder of the one-vote republic. He surpassed the Count de Chambord. The closest moment to the throne in Count Chambord's life was not when his uncle abdicated, but when the Napoleonic faction was discredited after the defeat of the Franco-Prussian War, and the throne of France had been sent to him. And this miracle son lived up to expectations and created a miracle. The reason why he failed to become the King of France was actually because of a flag. The Count of Chambord firmly resisted the tricolour flag and must restore the white flag of Bourbon. Even Pius IX complained about him, just for such a piece of rag. This king was born in 1820. His father was assassinated before he was born. As a posthumous son, he received education from his mother and uncle. Since he was a child. The Earl of Chambord received a standard eldest son's education. At the age of 10, he began to attend various reviews, banquets, and various royal and religious activities with great intensity. Therefore, he and Franz had the same problem. Count Chambord's mother was also a strongman. She had been operating in France through her identity as the Duchess of Berry, the mother of the legitimate heir to the throne. The turmoil within the Orleans dynasty at this time was closely related to it, especially the cooperation of the Orthodox faction. The Earl of Chambord was not stupid, but the education he received since childhood and his mother's example had impressed him with Orthodox ideas at this time. Even the Earl of Chambord was an outlier in the aristocratic circle. After all, times had changed, and many things in the past no longer existed. It was not difficult for Franz to persuade Count Chambord to attend the Congress of Vienna, because the experiences of the two had many similarities, and the latter had experienced great joys and sorrows in life, so he could sympathize with the former. Count Chambord also liked Vienna very much, because it was more luxurious than Edinburgh and more glitzy than London. Note: the Earl of Chambord went to Edinburgh, Scotland, when he was in exile, but he was not particularly fond of Britain. At the same time, the cleanliness of Vienna is unmatched by the UK. Whether it is air, water, or streets, Vienna is a city where it is easy to forget your sorrows, especially after Franz's renovation. The whole city is full of vitality. As a wealthy, depressed, and healthy adult man, Count Chambord quickly became the star of the dark Moon Theatre. There was nothing Franz could do about this. After all, their identities were too sensitive. If they had direct contact, there would be much more that could be interpreted. In order not to magnify the incident as much as possible, Franz decided to ask his staff in the theater to help pull the strings. Count Chambord was very interested in Franz's plan, and he also wanted to see what his opponent was like. There is another reason, that is, after Count Chambord heard about Franz's deeds and experiences, he felt that the two had the same problem. But the latter had better luck than the former. Franz, since you want to help me, I won't hide it from you. The situation inside Orleans is very bad, at least worse than you expected. As long as Austria can defeat France on the battlefield again, Louis Philippe will have to agree to it. Conditions of Franz looked at Count Chambord, who was speaking nonsense seriously, and sighed. I understand what you mean, but war can only be used as a last resort. War is not good for either country, and war between countries of equal strength is a disaster. And trust me, you're not the only one who wants Austria and France to go to war. You mean the British? They are busy waging wars around the world right now, and should have no time to care about things on the European continent. Americans, rebels in the Viceroyalty of La Plata, Maoris in New Zealand, Boers in South Africa, Kings in the East, and the Irish next door to them. In fact, the Scots also hate the British, but they were appeased by Robert Peel before. It would be interesting if the current British Prime Minister John Russell ignored this matter. At this time, Count Chambord looked at European affairs with a completely entertaining attitude. He gave his own opinions, based on what he saw and heard, but he was not entirely correct. The British are certainly busy, but it's possible that, because they can't get away, they want a conflict between France and Austria. so that it can maintain its supremacy. What about the Russians? Asked Count Chambord. The Russians have their troubles, the rebellion in the Caucasus, the cholera pandemic, the chaos in the country, and coupled with the Russian pattern, there shouldn't be any big moves in the short term. Well, what do you want? Although I can only live in exile across Europe, I will not do anything that endangers the interests of France. Speaking straight to the point like this, Count Chambord might not be a good politician, but he might be a good king. I want peace. It's that simple. It's that simple. Europe has been at peace for too long, and people don't know how to cherish it. Have you heard those horrific casualty figures? It's only tens of thousands. What's the fuss about? It may be affordable for France and Austria, but Switzerland is a small country with only a few million people. Such a casualty ratio is already staggering. Imagine if the two sides in the Swiss Civil War were replaced by Austria and France. Hearing this, Count Chambord couldn't help but feel a chill down his spine. He had been exposed to the army since he was very young. At that time, the French army still had the imprint of the Napoleonic era. There are many veterans with missing arms, legs, and one eye in the Invalides. When Count Chambord came to Vienna, he specifically went to the Invalides and the Austrian Empire. The life of the veterans at the Les Invalides in Austria was much better than that of the French veterans at the Les Invalides in Paris. At least they were not hungry. Okay, it's a deal, Count. Chambord felt that trusting others was a virtue, and the young man in front of him should be a trustworthy person. Franz played the Count of Chambord card, just to force Louis Philippe to come to Vienna, and then the two sides could solve the Swiss problem in an honorable way. However, Louis Philippe did not play his cards according to the routine, so the direction of the world quietly changed again. Chapter 812 The British Man's Trick. Paris, France. Baron Pasquier conveyed Metternich's words to Louis Philippe, much to the relief of the latter's staff. After all, it is more credible to say it from the enemy Austria. France and Austria will only carry out limited expansion, and at the same time, eliminate the pro-British forces in Switzerland, so that everyone will have an easier time. As for Henry V, referring to the Earl of Chambord, who only had one castle, let him go to hell. The only blame is that he didn't even have a single soldier, and it was a fool's errand to claim the throne. The British? Can they drive warships into the mountains? Limited expansion? I think they want to pretend to appease us and then take over Switzerland. The top leaders of the Orthodox Alliance are the puppets of the Austrians, and Archduke Carol is in Switzerland. Maybe they have already started taking action. The veins on Louis Philippe's head popped out, and his face was so ferocious that he was distorted. He didn't want to lose the opportunity to expand, let alone lose the French throne. He wished he had thrown Count Chambord to the ground back then. The British will not want Swiss territory, let alone fight in Switzerland, but they can take the opportunity to expand their overseas interests and weaken the strength of France and Austria. Moreover, having a direct border with Austria not only easily causes border friction, we also have to pay high border defense costs. Switzerland's land and population cannot bring us much benefit, and we may still need our assistance. Baron Pasquier argued that Louis Philippe seemed to think that all this was a lie, and that he was even deceiving him. However, the former has no idea what the latter wants. The latter only wants to win and use victory to dilute all doubts about him and all threats to his throne. In fact, Louis Philippe's sudden turn to extremes had a lot to do with the assassination of his spy. On the surface, this spy was an opponent, but privately he was a close friend of Louis Philippe. He helped Louis Philippe collect many important information, but recently the spy's body had been recovered and pieced together from several directions in Paris, and Louis Philippe felt both anger and horror. Intelligence gathered by spies showed that opponents always liked to criticize Louis Philippe for his incompetence. The speaker was unintentional, but the listener was intentional. Louis Philippe felt that maybe his achievements were too little, so those people would oppose him. So on the other hand, would it mean that people would support him as long as he opened up new territories? Louis Philippe has been unable to sleep at night these days, repeating his imaginary theories over and over again, which is why he became paranoid at this time. Are you afraid of the Austrians, or did you accept Metternich's favor in Vienna? The two most shameless diplomats in European history are the Lame Talleyrand, who was a domestic slave of 3 surnames, and this capricious old fox, upon Hearing this, everyone understood that His Majesty the King had made up his mind, and any objections would be taken to the sword. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I'm not afraid of the Austrians, nor have I received any benefits from them. I just hope that you will be able to stay in power forever. Baron Pasquier wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He did not expect Louis Philippe to have such a big reaction. It seemed that the Vienna conference was in ruins. It would probably become a laughingstock like the British London conference. At the same time, France's relations with Austria were also over. In fact, in addition to the death of his close friend, the media in Paris also contributed a lot. French newspapers developed very early, so they are very powerful in public opinion. Since the outbreak of the Swiss Civil War, the French public and media have not shown much interest in their neighbors living in the ravine, and it did not even appear on the first page. And starting from one day, the trend of public opinion suddenly turned, and major newspapers in France began to report on it crazily. These arguments are also very consistent. That is, promoting the Austrian threat and conspiracy theories that Austria is preparing to monopolize Switzerland. Generally speaking, the supreme ruler of a country will laugh off the things in the newspaper, and it is almost impossible to govern the country according to them. However, Louis Philippe was not an ordinary ruler. He actually took what was written in the newspaper seriously. In fact, this is Palmerston's conspiracy, one of the common tactics used by the Anglo-Saxons to build public opinion. Of course, the Napoleonic faction also contributed to this. If soldiers want to improve their status, they must make themselves useful. And nothing needs more protection than a country threatened by a powerful and evil neighbor. So the existence of Austria as an enemy is necessary. Franz's intelligence officers in Paris also tried to fight back, but failed under the attack of two powerful enemies, and did not restore the decline in public opinion. Subsequently, Austria received news that France refused to participate in the Vienna conference. As soon as the news came out, the happiest people were the British. John Russell said to the cabinet members, "I didn't expect that we wouldn't have to wait until the Swiss Civil War ended. Before this war was over, another one was about to begin." But what he didn't know was that another invisible war had already begun. Palmerston did not like John Russell, whom he believed lacked talent. The latter also dislikes the former, because the latter thinks the former is too arrogant. So when Palmerston explained the reason to the cabinet members, he was ridiculed by John Russell. To put it simply, it is impossible for any head of state to act according to the logic in the newspaper. After the news reached Vienna, the leaders of the German states were a little confused, and it seemed that the banquet had to end early. Prussia regarded it as a huge diplomatic victory. If Austria was defeated, its influence would be weakened, no matter what the final result was. Despite the ebb and flow, Prussia still retained the fire to unify Germany. Hanover and Bavaria had similar reactions. They both felt that the Vienna conference had become a joke. However, the Austrian Imperial government announced as quickly as possible that the Congress of Vienna would be held in advance. Franz and Metternich both knew that this was the best way at this time. Even if it was a one-man show, they had to sing well. After all, there were so many audiences in the audience. In fact, Franz and Metternich both had Plan B, but it was much more radical than Plan A in Switzerland. Duffer's siege strategy was too resource intensive, and the guerrillas put a lot of pressure on the Free States logistics. Joseph Loy couldn't stand it anymore, and he had to replace Duffer, but he wouldn't use a warlord like Frei Holosa, so Joseph Loy found Aoi Flano, a former general of the Kingdom of Sardinia who was recuperating in Switzerland. This old man claimed that he had fought with Napoleon and Archbishop Charles. When the latter heard that the Free States' military strength was 3 times that of the Orthodox Alliance, he immediately chose to join the Free Alliance and said that he could capture the entire territory of Switzerland within 3 months. Chapter 813 sent troops. The Sardinian general who claimed to have fought alongside Napoleon soon succeeded Duffer as the commander-in-chief of the Free Alliance. The latter was imprisoned for many crimes, including delaying fighter planes and awaiting post-war trial. This was the result of Joseph Loy's efforts. Because Duffer executed too many deserters in the previous war, there were naturally many people with backgrounds among them, and they would not let go of this opportunity. To add insult to injury. Among the deserters here were officers who were afraid of the enemy. However, Joseph Loy knew that Dufa was innocent, and the latter did not want to participate in the war. It was the former who asked the latter to come out. So Joseph Roy tried his best to keep Dufa, but the death penalty could not be avoided, and a life sentence or exile was indispensable. On the other hand, the two surrendered states of Freiburg and Zug can no longer hold on. The property of the church and the Orthodox has been almost wiped out, and the civilians have been squeezed to the limit. Joseph Roy knew it had to be open source, so he targeted the cantons of Argau and St. Gallen. Although these two states chose to side with the Free Alliance before the war began, they did not belong to the Free States, and had a lot to draw from. The cantons of Argau and St. Gallen strongly opposed it, because the top leaders of St. Gallen were church forces, but their opposition was ineffective. St. Gallen and Argau were liberalized, and they had to bear heavy burdens with the cantons of Zug and Fribourg. Burden of war. However, where there is oppression, there is resistance, especially the people of Zug state who have become traitors for no apparent reason. Not only do they have to bear huge war expenses and provide materials and labor for the war, but even their own homeland has become the center of war between the Free State and the Orthodox state battlefield. The people of Zug state spontaneously organized guerrillas and began to resist the rule of the Free Alliance, purging those high-level officials who had turned them into firewood. The state of Fribourg was also overwhelmed. Almost all their young people were expropriated, and their valuables and food were also robbed. The residents of the towns began to flee deep into the mountains, successfully starting the process of counter-urbanization. The situation in Argau Canton is the worst, because Freddy Hilosai doesn't regard them as human beings at all. Freddy Hilosai couldn't beat the guerrillas, but he wouldn't admit it. As a result, the Catholics in Argau became the best scapegoats, and at the behest of Joseph Roy, they were repeatedly plundered. As for foreign mercenaries, it is impossible to save the people of the hostile forces. The desperate Argau people want to resist, but have no weapons. The collective rebellion of the top leaders makes them lack leadership. The uprising can only usher in more ferocious revenge. If you want to survive, you can only serve as a soldier for Freddy Hilosai, or go to the mountains to find guerrillas, but neither side regards them as their own, and most of these people still escape. Can't bear the fate of cannon fodder. The new federal commander-in-chief of the Free State, Aoi Flano, decided to launch a general attack on the Lucerne state as soon as he took office. The process of the war was still uneventful, with no suspense, no twists and turns, and no tactics to speak of. What the two sides competed for was courage and endurance. Both sides of the civil war obviously lacked courage and endurance. The fighting always started and stopped, and the scenes were even a little funny. However, the defending side is, after all, occupying a condescending geographical advantage, so the attacking side always suffers. There was a decisive gap in the level of the generals on both sides. Compared to Aoi Flano, who only knew how to charge with human seed tactics, Archduke Karol's strategy was obviously more reasonable. After more than 10 days of fierce attack, Aoi Flano finally discovered that the soldiers of the Free State were not suitable for fighting tough battles. Their morale was too low, and they would often flee after losing a small number of people and wanted to regroup them. It takes a long time to come together, so Aoi Flano chose the same tactics as Dufa, and the Free State soldiers dug trenches again. As time goes by, the situation across Switzerland is deteriorating. Aoi Flano was also imprisoned, and Joseph Roy had to compromise with Free Hilosai. Although the latter obtained the power and status he dreamed of, he was not happy at all, because the war exhausted the states, and the states were unwilling to provide money and people, and the Argau and Saint Germain rebels who defected to the Free Alliance side Rennes, Fribourg, and Zug are already experiencing civil unrest. Only then did Free Hilosai realize the importance of ending the war quickly. However, in order not to repeat the same mistakes, he decided to attack the relatively weak Swiss state, but he only received an even more disastrous defeat. In other words, it failed before it even started, because after the Free State troops withdrew, the Orthodox Alliance troops quickly attacked in all directions. Vaud, Bern, Solothurn, Basel, Argau, and the entire western Switzerland were devastated by the flames of war. Devour a few months of war is enough to turn farmers into butchers. One can imagine what state the Orthodox Alliance soldiers are in now. Under the cloud of death for several months his hometown was stolen, and fierce conflicts broke out among the factions in the Swiss army. The scale and intensity of the conflict far exceeded the conflict between the Free State and the Orthodox Union. Free Holosai is just a larger warlord. He is unable to bridge the conflicts between the various factions. At the same time, his home base has also been attacked, leaving other factions to defend their home base. Free Holosai couldn't do it. He didn't trust those guys, and those guys didn't trust each other. As a result, the foundation supporting the entire alliance collapsed, and hundreds of thousands of troops dispersed into warlords fighting on their own. These warlords were naturally vulnerable to Archduke Karol, so the counterattack of the Orthodox alliance began, and the first to bear the brunt was Bern, the strongest in the Free State. Before the start of the war, Bern Canton Commander Ges Chad told Governor Usotlov, "It will take at least 10 years for the Orthodox Alliance's army to invade Bern." Bern fell 10 days later. In fact, Doofus' strategy was right, attacking from the front and outflanking. However, the appearance of the reconnaissance hot air balloon exposed his actions. The elite troops led by Sigismund were unable to compete with the patchwork shepherds of the Free State. In fact, Archduke Karol was better at attacking cities than defending them. However, the quality of Austrian soldiers, weapons, and even military strength in history could not be compared with France, so there was a stereotype that Archduke Karol could only defend cities. This battle shocked the whole of Switzerland, and even the whole of Europe, but the most shocked was not the Swiss, but the French. The French cabinet held a meeting overnight, with Louis Philippe also attending a rare high-profile meeting. Although the Swiss Confederation's army is vulnerable to the French, it is human instinct to seek advantages and avoid disadvantages, and no one wants to bite this hard nut first. However, the situation in the Swiss Civil War took a turn for the worse at this time. If the Orthodox faction were to win, would they establish a pro-Austrian country, let alone carving up Switzerland? I'm afraid that, in turn, it will be restrained by the small country of Switzerland. Even Marshal Soult, who was thinking about retiring, was in uniform. It was the first time, since the establishment of the July dynasty, that the whole of France was so united. Louis Philippe signed the order that night. France announces sending troops to Switzerland. Almost at the same time, the German Confederation announced its intervention in the Swiss Civil War. Chapter 814 Grabbing Territory. The Kingdom of Sardinia also announced that it would send troops to Switzerland, but Carlo Alberto had a problem. If he wanted to send troops to Switzerland, he could only go through Valais and Ticino. However, the roads in Valais were too rough and difficult for large armies to pass, and Ticino was occupied by French generals at this time. Charles Duchat had already raised the French flag in Ticino. Naturally, he would not agree to the request of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Instead, he ordered the border to be sealed. As a result, Carlo Alberto found himself in a very embarrassing situation, with no way out, and no city to occupy. The French dispatched troops at an alarmingly fast pace, but there were not many routes for France to attack Switzerland. They either took Lake Geneva or Neuchâtel. There are not many ships on the former lake, and the French have never thought of building warships in the inner lake. But that doesn't mean the Swiss don't have it. Vaud attaches great importance to the development of water power, and has more than 20 large and small battleships. Although they are all pocket battleships of less than 100 tons, their total tonnage is not as heavy as the flagship of the French Grand Orient Fleet. But that is not something that civilian fishing boats can handle. In short, the French's water power on Lake Geneva is not as good as the Swiss. The latter was also very troublesome. Neuchâtel was actually a royal territory of Prussia, and William I, who was responsible for garrisoning here at this time, was determined not to allow French troops to enter. Although he only brought 500 people with him, William I was a member of the Prussian royal family after all, and he still had great appeal, and he quickly raised a militia team of 8,000 people. Even 18,000 people are not enough in front of the French army, but fighting in mountainous areas does not guarantee a quick victory with more people, and William's identity is too sensitive, and a big incident will occur if he is not careful. As a result, the French army fell into a very embarrassing situation for a while on the other hand, the armies of the German Confederation began to rush forward like chicken blood. When a pigeon letter was delivered to Prince William I, he immediately became manic. he immediately announced that the road to France would be blown up, and then the entire army rushed to Jura. Note, Jura, also translated as Jura, is located in the north of Neuchâtel. The three South German countries of Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria sent troops to cross Lake Constance overnight. Even the Archduke of Liechtenstein led 300 soldiers from across the country to attack Graubünden overnight. The states in the North German region also had money and strength to contribute, and soldiers and supplies rushed to the Swiss theater like crazy. At this time, the Austrian army seemed very calm and only sent a force of 20,000 people to Switzerland. Led by Archduke Franz at this time, the Swiss no longer wanted to fight, whether it was the warlords at the top or the people at the bottom. As a result, most of the German Confederate troops who were beaten to death chose to surrender. Since everyone spoke the same language and looked similar, there was no sense of disobedience in accepting it, and there were not many bloodshed incidents. The very few who resisted were attacked from both inside and outside. No matter how strong the fortress or the dangerous terrain was, they could not protect them. Soon the Swiss Free State was almost completely occupied, and the French were still stuck on the shores of Lake Geneva. Only then did Louis Philippe realize that he had made a mistake, and Baron Pasquier was once again sent to Vienna in the hope of negotiating with the Austrian Empire. At this time, Free State Representative Joseph Loy once again proposed using negotiations to solve Switzerland's internal problems. The Orthodox Alliance's state representative Constantin Sigvort and Field Marshal Ulrich Salas felt that the other party was at the end of its strength, and it was a good opportunity to regain its previous position. Result: Joseph Loy looked a little tired. He lit a cigar and coughed up blood as soon as he put it in his mouth. "Gentlemen, you have time for a cigarette. Of course, you can also choose not to sign." As a result, the third document that humiliated the country appeared in the headquarters of the Orthodox Alliance. This time, representatives from various states resolutely refused to recognize the legitimacy of this document, but it was legal. So everyone came up with a good way to disband the Orthodox Alliance. Wouldn't that be good? Seeing that the situation was over, Joseph Loy decided to sell the cantons of Vaud and Geneva to Louis Philippe. The price agreed upon by the two parties was 20 million francs and a ticket to the New World. The United States, the desperate and distressed Louis Philippe, naturally had no choice but to agree to the deal. Joseph Loy was still somewhat happy when he signed the territory transfer agreement. After all, the heavy burden was finally lifted. However, after the French army landed in Geneva, the first thing they did was to capture Joseph Loy and deliver him to Archduke Carol, who was stationed in Bern. The purpose was naturally to show goodwill. With the cantons of Geneva and Vaud being occupied by the French, the Swiss Civil War also came to an end. Only the cantons of Geneva, Vaud, and Ticino that originally belonged to the Swiss Confederation were in the hands of the French. The remaining states were either in the hands of the Orthodox Alliance or under the occupation of the German Confederation. Louis Philippe had already suffered 2 losses at the hands of the German Confederation. He did not want to make the same mistake again, but he could not figure out why the loose German Confederation chose to side with Austria. It would not be surprising if some countries close to Austria would do this, but the 3 South German countries have always been wavering, and Prussia is Austria's opponent. It is too abnormal for them to do this. It's actually very simple, because at a temporary meeting in Vienna, Franz announced that Austria would only take back the Argau canton where his homeland of Eagle Castle is located, and Switzerland would join the German Confederation. However, these 2 points are not the most important. The most important point is the last point, which is that, in order to prevent another outbreak of war, all 3 states must choose a German monarch. You must know that it is already the 19th century, and there are not many opportunities for those small countries to expand their territory. Moreover, Switzerland is mainly German, so it is not difficult to rule. As a result, the entire German Confederation went crazy, and even Prussia went crazy, because they were on a first come first served basis, and the Hohenzollern family's territory in Neuchâtel was the best springboard. That's why William I was so desperate. After all, except for a few powerful countries on the European continent, it was too difficult to expand territory. Moreover, the Austrian Empire has made it clear that it will only return to its ancestral homeland and will not occupy too much territory. How can such generosity prevent these German princes from shouting Franz's heroic name? In fact, the resources in Switzerland are of little value to Austria, so historically Austria and France have used it as a buffer zone, but taking back their ancestral land will indeed increase Austria's influence. As for the population, Franz can attract people from North Germany, and he can also attract people from Switzerland. The biggest advantage of this is to use the German Confederation as a barrier, and those states have to seek Austrian support for stability. To put it simply, it kills two birds with one stone, gaining fame and avoiding real disaster. Chapter 815 Devastated. It only took a week from the declaration of the German Confederation in France to the end of the war, and there was almost no resistance from the Free States, because the war in the past few months has emptied Switzerland's wealth. In fact, Switzerland's wealth is not rich. One is due to natural reasons. Switzerland can be said to be surrounded by mountains and rivers, with pleasant scenery, but it can also be said that the poor mountains and rivers breed unruly people. The mountainous country was already poor in products, coupled with the second reason, the rise of industry in the Austrian Empire. Whether it was textiles, printing and dyeing, iron processing, or the watch industry that the Swiss were proud of, they were all defeated by Franz. On the contrary, the agriculture, wool, and breeding industries have bucked the trend and have risen, and the tourism industry has ushered in great development. However, due to some sheepherds and illegal shops, the reputation has been extremely poor, and it has not been able to realize its full potential. In fact, it is not uncommon for tourists to be ripped off in tourist areas, but some places are asking for money, and some places are asking for lives. The depths of the inaccessible mountains can not only appreciate the majesty of nature, but it can also be a good place for murderers to kill people and abandon their bodies. In addition, the Alps are not only in Switzerland. You can also enjoy the beautiful scenery in Austria. And under Franz's planning and rectification, Austria's tourism industry is also not comparable to Switzerland. Austria's tourism industry is almost entirely in the hands of Franz. The economies of scale can make costs lower and gain more bargaining power. Standard, professional, safe, high quality and low price. The new travel company adhering to the modern concept completely surpasses the private travel company that has just started. However, the phenomenon of ripping off customers also exists, but professionals have many ways to make those people willingly be ripped off. As for transporting passenger flow to the royal shopping mall, this is one of the important reasons why Franz engaged in tourism. Under the blow of the dimensionality reduction of the tourism industry in the Austrian Empire, the tourism industry in Switzerland is also in danger because of the rise of Austria and the thickening of trade barriers by France and the Kingdom of Sardinia. It is very difficult for Switzerland to support itself by making extra money as it has in history. Under the constraints of many parties, it would be strange if Switzerland could still have a rich family fortune. During the war, local officials in Switzerland had great power, which exceeded their capabilities. Therefore, whether it was their intention or not, the area under their jurisdiction was in chaos. Chaotic soil will always breed all kinds of monsters, and Switzerland is no exception. The damage they cause will eventually be passed on to ordinary people. After this period of baptism, no one among the people at the bottom wants to continue the war. Therefore, no matter how beautiful the speeches of those Free State officials were, and how sincere their feelings were, they could no longer impress ordinary people. In fact, Swiss local officials will not continue the war as long as they have some conscience, except for warlords such as Friedrichshafen. They have tasted the sweetness of power and do not want to look back, or they are unable to turn back. Franz didn't want them to turn back, let alone give them a chance to turn back. It was not easy for these garbage borers to find opportunities to clean up in a court area like Switzerland, so Franz would naturally not leave any room for them. These small warlords initially wanted to negotiate alone with the German Confederation, but the German monarchs who had been beaten to death by Franz did not want to reduce their chances of receiving land. In fact, some states hope to stay in certain places by creating a fait accompli. For example, the three South German states are relatively close to Switzerland. If they can get those nearby lands, who wants enclaves? So there was no room for negotiation at all, either surrender or fight. Freddy Holloser even came to Franz's temporary military camp in person. The Austrian troops were greeted as they entered the canton of St. Gallen, and those who wanted to resist, and those who might resist, were rounded up by those who did not. Franz still had to pay attention to his image, so he decided to hand over the power of trial to the people. Public sentencing usually starts with the death penalty, so Franz is not worried about what harm will be left behind. Of course, this only refers to this time. As for the future, we will talk about it later, but this kind of national fanaticism made him a little uneasy. These Swiss people had become part of the German Confederation, but they had already started shouting "Long live Germany!" The advantage is that Franz does not have to worry about the Germans in Switzerland being unwilling to join the German Confederation, because under the influence of such fanatical emotions, the torrent will sweep away everything, whether they want it or not. It was impossible for Franz to meet the so-called interim president of the Swiss Confederation, Frei Hollos. Even if he refused in person and scolded him, it would definitely be passed down as a legend in the future. The Prince of Justice rejects the enemy of evil. Temptation. However, Franz does not lack this kind of reputation, and he can make up whatever he wants after the other party is dead. There is no need to take this risk. In fact, this period of time is not suitable to meet the other party, let alone whether Freddy Holloser is sincere or has a conspiracy. Merely meeting him could be misinterpreted by fanatical German nationalists as a symbol of weakness and lack of firmness. As for the deduction, it is completely unnecessary, because the opponent's strength is not enough to stop the entire German Confederation. The last generation of warlords who succeeded in usurping power in troubled times only served as interim president for less than 10 days before setting himself on fire in his own presidential palace. The death of Freddy Holloser was just a microcosm. Because Franz had set an example in front of him, other German Confederate armies also followed suit and wiped out the top leaders of the Free States in a very short period of time. Franz was warmly welcomed all the way to Algo, but Franz did not ride a horse, but sat in a specially made carriage. In fact, it is better to say that it is a special carriage than a special carriage. The entire carriage is made of 10 centimeters thick bulletproof glass. This thickness can already block the bullets of rifles in this era. Even in later generations, it will still require a 12.7mm bullet to penetrate. Theoretically, a rifle can shoot 10 shots at the same point to penetrate it, but considering the rate of fire of rifles in this era, Franz didn't think the attacker had that chance. The advantage of such a transparent carriage is that it allows the public to see Franz, while ensuring his safety to the greatest extent. We did encounter an attack along the way, but the attacker's weapon was a dagger. Moreover, the attacker was not professional. He was shot dead before he could reach the carriage. The dagger he threw before his death did not even scratch the glass. Austria occupied Algo, Baden occupied Thurgau, Bavaria occupied St. Gallen, Württemberg occupied Unterhausen, and William I of Prussia led his army to occupy Jura. The most interesting thing is that the Archduke of Liechtenstein led 300 warriors to successfully capture Graubünden. In fact, the local defenders did not know that the opponent only had such a few people. The South German countries are the first to win, and they will not let go of this opportunity for expansion. Of course, this is also the acquiescence of Austria. As for the Jura state occupied by Prussia, this was even more what Franz expected. Let the Prussians guard the Swiss pass and block the French from Austria. Killing two birds with one stone is perfect. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 816 Seed King. At this time, the two Prussian enclaves were like a sharp sword on the waist of France, and they were also like a piece of meat on the lips of the French. But no matter what, it will be difficult for the two sides to become friends again, unless one party can sacrifice its own interests and promote an alliance. However, this requires great courage, great wisdom and great sacrifice, because in this era of rapidly rising nationalism, ceding territory is tantamount to betraying the country. Although it was an enclave, the Prussian people were still excited by the victory in the war. Prince William's heroic deeds became the biggest topic in Berlin for a while. At this time, Prussia hoped to keep this enclave from top to bottom, so King Frederick William IV of Prussia took the opportunity to move around Vienna with the purpose of ensuring that the Jura-state could fall into his pocket. As for why it has to be Jura, one is for the family's heroic legend, and the second and most important factor is that administrative costs are low and relatively easy to control. Before Prince William, later William I, came to Neuchâtel this time, Neuchâtel, as an enclave, had already owed taxes to the Prussian royal family for decades now. Prince William has recovered all the principal and interest at once, which actually only cost more than 2 million Swiss francs. About 500,000 Prussian thalers. In fact, the local tax rate set by the Hohenzollern family is very low, and there are many preferential policies. But since the sky is high and the emperor is far away, no one cares at all. At this moment, at that moment, the Swiss Civil War broke out. The German Confederation wiped out the Free State forces like a whirlwind, and the Neuchâtel people who once violently attacked the king's tax collectors became obedient people again closer to home. Frederick William IV personally went around, and princes from all walks of life gathered in Vienna. And the natural effect was outstanding. In fact, it was nothing more than being moved with affection and courtesy. Although giving the Jura-state to Prussia had long been planned, Metternich still knocked the other party in order to increase his credibility. At the previous Congress of Vienna, Franz was present on behalf of Ferdinand I. The latter was unfit to attend due to physical reasons, so Prime Minister Metternich had to do it for him at this time. On the other hand, the French finally became anxious, and Baron Pasquier and a formal delegation visited Vienna again. However, they were left alone and instead witnessed the spoils sharing meeting within the German Confederation. The South German countries were the biggest beneficiaries in this parliament. Austria got back its homeland of Allgäu, Baden got the nearby Thurgau, Bavaria got the strategic location of St. Gallen, Liechtenstein really got Graubünden, and Prussia also got what it wanted. Arrived in Jura. Saxony got Zurich, Hanover got Glarus, Hesse got Solothurn, and Bern became an enclave of Luxembourg. At the same time, the German Confederation decided to accept the applications of the former Swiss Orthodox Union states, and accept them as members of the German Confederation. They are Lucerne, Schwyz, Walden, Uri, Fribourg, Valais and Ticino. When he heard about Ticino, Baron Pasquier couldn't sit still, because it was obviously occupied by France. However, only then did he realize that the target of his negotiations had changed. His opponent was no longer Austria, but the entire German Confederation. As for the Orthodox alliance, their army is still in the hands of Archduke Karol, and France is now extremely passive. But something more disturbing soon happened. According to Franz's plan, these members who had just joined the German Confederation were free to choose their own monarch. As luck would have it, the public representatives of the canton of Ticino chose Carlo Alberto, King of the Kingdom of Sardinia, as their new monarch. Naturally, this cannot be a coincidence, considering that Ticino state was still in the hands of Charles Duchet at this time. In fact, the public opinion representative is from the Kingdom of Sardinia, but the situation at this time is already very clear. That is, Germany and the Kingdom of Sardinia are coming together to deceive themselves. Moreover, if the Kingdom of Sardinia dares to stand up and challenge France, it must be fully prepared. At this time, France has two options. One is to abandon Ticino and leave Geneva and Vaud in peace. The other is to go to full-scale war with the German Confederation, Switzerland, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. At this time, the enthusiasm of the German princes has not yet dissipated. After all, those small countries will have to burn incense if they are not annexed. It is definitely a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to expand their territory at this time. Coupled with the blessing of nationalism, the streets and alleys of Vienna were full of demonstrations, and successive victories made people think that France was nothing more than that. This situation is all too familiar to the French. It is simply a replica of the French Revolution, but the reasons and circumstances have changed. Baron Pasquier was so frightened that he could only ask King Louis Philippe for a decision. There was an immediate quarrel in France, but neither Louis Philippe nor Soult wanted to take this risk. At the same time, the enfeoffment and transformation operations were in full swing. With the enfeoffment plan, France left a good impression on the German monarchs. At least no one would question his IQ in person. After 2 rounds, almost all the states were satisfied, and those princes who were not allocated land were also compensated with funds, of course. This money was made from the people's fat and money plundered by the Free State warlords. In fact, due to the poor performance of the Orthodox state bureaucrats in the Civil War, the people have already complained about them. Replacing these people at this time is completely in line with public opinion, and can even be described as pleasing to the people. Franz was puzzled that he could succeed in the same trick 3 times in a row. In the last group of governors and representatives, no woman had the guts. Sister Brandy's mutilated body was finally found in the dungeon beneath the Geneva City Hall. It was carefully packaged and sent to the Vatican by the Jesuit priests. It seemed that there was great hope for canonization. There are many advantages to enfeoffing the German monarchy, because it can greatly reduce the waste of resources by integrating some German states that are too small, such as Saxony and Hesse, as well as Anhalt, Lippe, etc. One of them, Hesse, included the electorate, the Grand Duchy, and the counties. Franz saw a headache and decided to help them. Austria also successfully pulled the German Confederation over as its own shield, the outermost of which was Prussia, so that it could always maintain a passive position. Compared to those time travelers who only farmed the land, Franz prefers farming kings. In fact, such scattered enfeoffment was intentional by Franz. Switzerland was different from Germany. The former had a small population, barren land, and decentralized power. If they wanted to rise, they could only plan unifiedly. There is only one country in South Germany that can shoulder this important task, and that is the Austrian Empire. Whether they want to develop their economy or maintain their rule, they cannot do without the support of the Austrian Empire. On the 5th day after the end of the first round of tripartite negotiations between the German Confederation, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and France, the British finally got the news. Chapter 817 Compromise between Britain and France. London, Whitehall. The constant, distraught banging on the table is a good representation of John Russell's state of mind, as he had no idea what British intelligence was doing. After so many years, Vienna's fast communication network has not yet been built. At this time, news from Paris can be sent to London within a day. You must know that with the density of railways in Austria and the German Confederation at this time, it would only take less than 5 days to take a train from Vienna to Rotterdam, and then take a boat to London. However, the intelligence agency of the British Empire took 5 days, which made John Russell have to doubt its professionalism. However, this is because the new Prime Minister is unprofessional. All intelligence transmissions must be approved first. Just 2 reviews alone will take 2 days. In addition, plus changing cars and waiting for the ship on the road, 3 days is already very fast. However, this also reflects from the side that the UK still does not pay enough attention to Austria as an opponent, and it pays more attention to its old rival. Just like the way intelligence is transmitted, the intelligence from Vienna to London must be reviewed at all levels. Even important information such as Austria's dispatch of troops to Switzerland must be confirmed first according to the process. However, the news from Paris can go through the wartime mechanism. Only preliminary confirmation will be done, bypassing the complicated review and confirmation process, and the information will be sent to the Prime Minister's office first. There is another thing that makes John Russell very depressed. That is, it was obviously a stalemate 2 weeks ago, but why suddenly the war is over and everyone starts to divide the spoils? What the hell is the German Confederation? Shouldn't this be a problem for Austria and France? Why did Austria, the German Confederation, and Sardinia suddenly join forces to fight against France? Palmerston was very annoyed that his script had been tampered with, but in any case the feud between France and Austria was settled. John Russell was very dissatisfied, but France was obviously weaker than the Triple Alliance at this time, and Louis Philippe was not a very courageous person. Could it be that Britain wanted to serve as a pawn for the French? That is of course impossible. At this time, Palmerston's advice is, we should send people to Vienna to thank all countries for their efforts for European peace. This can reduce the resistance to our diplomacy in the future. John Russell rolled his eyes at his foreign minister. It was difficult for him to imagine that there was such a shameless person in the world, and that this person was sitting next to him. However, this is indeed in line with the British diplomatic strategy at this time. After all, Russia is Britain's biggest enemy, followed by France. As for Austria, which spends all day in the Adriatic Sea, it is not yet in the eyes of the British. He wanted to laugh when he mentioned the so-called German Confederation. It was strange that this alliance composed of dozens of countries was really capable of fighting. As for Switzerland's allies, sorry, the British Empire, only make friends with the victors. In contrast, Louis Philippe was very determined in agreeing to the Vienna Agreement. In fact, France did not lack brave men and militants. The Napoleonic element were staunch militants who desperately wanted to regain power, and the best way was through war. However, France's finances were on the verge of bankruptcy at this time, and the continuous consumption of domestic and foreign wars made its troops stretched thin. Moreover, the Orleans faction headed by Louis Philippe did not want to see the military take power, let alone the return of the Napoleon family. There was great confusion within the Orthodox faction. Some people wanted to instigate Louis Philippe to go to war, and then take the opportunity to promote Count Chambord to the throne. Some people want to avoid war, because starting a war at this time is not good for France. The war may not only fail to support the Count of Chambord, but may also repeat the mistakes of the French Revolution. The reason why some people want to go to war is because the goods they have hoarded cannot be sold, and the reason why some people don't want to go to war is because they still have a lot of business abroad. In the end, Louis Philippe chose peace because the enemy was too powerful and the domestic rebels were too arrogant. There were secret societies of workers, and pamphlets on various social ideas were everywhere, even attracting two great men to watch. However, the speaker was not a black man, but a group of famous sociologists in history. Orthodoxy, the church, and Pius IX were connected in tandem. For Louis Philippe, it was simply disgusting, and opened the door to disgust. It was so disgusting. Louis Philippe personally appointed 77 bishops in the hope of diluting the influence of the church, but this intensity was not able to eliminate the influence established by the church for thousands of years at once. On the contrary, it brought the church and the Orthodox together firmly. Pius IX even took the opportunity to collect debts, and demanded that France pay back the tithes it had owed for many years. The Orleans faction was also unstable, such as the Barrett faction, which wanted Louis Philippe to rule without rule. In addition to those who publicly expressed their hope that the king would hand over power, there were also a large number of small factions with their own agendas. Louis Philippe has gone through 17 cabinets in his 18 years in office, and the degree of turmoil is evident. Democrats and Republicans also appeared on the stage of history at this time. There were also many mountains in the army, and personal factions were more common than political factions. For example, the fence-sitters led by Prime Minister Sirte do not want to offend anyone, but at the same time they firmly safeguard their own interests. Domestic worker strikes and peasant uprisings also occurred from time to time, and the chaos in the colonies reached a terrifying level. But at this time, Louis Philippe felt that the situation at this time could still be barely controlled, but if there was another war, he didn't know. He didn't want to take any risks, not even once. There is also a lot of land in the two states, which is better than the time in Belgium. At least he did not lose troops or generals. And Louis Philippe felt that he had discovered a talent. Charles Duchet, a general who was rising from the grassroots. The former feels that the latter can be used to divide and disintegrate the Bonapartists, and the latter also feels that the former will be its biggest stepping stone. As a result, the Vienna Conference in 1847 was successfully held and achieved gratifying results, making a huge contribution to peace in Europe. All the 5 major powers sent people to participate. Except for Britain and France, the heads of state gathered together. It was the first grand event after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. From then on, Switzerland disappeared from the map, and most of the participating countries received new territories, and even if they did not get land, they were given money as a consolation prize. Franz was sitting in the Eagle Castle in a daze. In history, Austria had tried to regain its ancestral land 3 times, but all ended in failure. In the end, in order to prevent the Langsing land from being turned into a public toilet by the Swiss, the Habsburg family had to pay repair funds to Switzerland every year to protect this long-lasting building. Later generations of Eagle Castle, which Franz visited, was an inconspicuous small castle built in the mountains. However, by this time it was in ruins, and Friar Hilossa's last order was to burn the Eagle Keep. If Franz had not wanted to take it back, this small castle would have been preserved as a monument until the 21st century. But the reality is that our enemies are so shameless, either taking advantage of their own people or venting their anger on a building that won't move. So, when Franz learned that Friar Hilossa did not burn himself to death, but chose to escape halfway, Franz had some special thoughts. Chapter 818. Do you believe it? At first, when Franz heard that Friar Hilossa had burned himself to death, the former was still thinking about how to avenge the burning of his ancestral land, and whether he could avenge it. As a result, when he saw the latter, Franz was shocked. Friar Hilossa's clothes were all intact, not to mention burns, which were not even considered burns. He escaped because he was too hot and was caught by people watching the excitement outside. There were 2 bruises on his face that may have been caused by being beaten at that time. Colonel Monta, who was accompanying him, felt that torture should be used. Burning someone's ancestral home is a very serious sin in any region or culture. This is a very serious provocation and humiliation. We will plant him in front of the Eagle Castle and let the eagles on the Alps deal with him. This will just serve as a warning to those potential enemies, telling them that there is a price to pay for challenging the empire and the family. Colonel Monta fought one battle along the way, killing an assassin who only had a dagger at this time. He was eager to express himself, and if the matter of burning the ancestral home was done to ordinary nobles, it would be a matter of life and death. Colonel Monta felt that Franz must feel the same way, and hoped to use the most cruel way to attack the enemy. However, Colonel Bordeaux, the attendant at the side, felt that Franz would not be so reckless based on the way he usually handled things. As the leader of the rebels, Friar Hilossa must be as full of sins as the Swiss magistrates we encountered before. We may be able to hand over this right to the people as usual and try him before his death. It was done before in Poland. However, for the sake of safety, this kind of heinous person is often very powerful in the local area. In order to prevent secondary harm to the people, I propose to cut off his tongue or put a cage on him so that he cannot hurt him with bad words. Franz touched his chin. He was surprised that Bordeaux could say such a thing. It seemed that he was really making progress. As for Colonel Monta's emotions, it was difficult for Franz to empathize with them, and his approach was too ill-considered. It feels good to torture yourself, but what will historians and the media say? The prosperity of Austria's powerful Habsburg family is naturally not a big problem, and it is even said to be a brave and bloody representative. But what about when it goes downhill or encounters setbacks? I'm afraid those people who are praising me at this time will just jump out and add insult to injury. Bordeaux's method is good, and Franz has done it before. The purpose can be achieved, and the pot can be thrown out. But the situation we face at this time is different. If someone bullies you, and you still don't have any emotions, you won't be regarded as incomprehensible, but just as a joke after dinner. But Franz still won't deal with him personally, because there is a more efficient way to deal with it. In fact, Franz had another person in his hands, and that was former President Joseph Loy. This man was sent by the French. Joseph Loy and Friar Hilossa are really brothers in need. The latter attempted self-immolation, while the former betrayed his country and successfully ran away. Louis Philippe most likely did not want to pay the 20 million francs, and at the same time he had the intention to show goodwill to the Austrian side. After all, the power of both parties had reversed at that time. In fact, the French had another meaning in doing this, that is, they hoped to get rid of Joseph Loy with the help of the Austrian Empire. The advantage of doing this is that you don't have to bear the infamy, which makes it easier for you to wash away your image as an aggressor and make France look more like a protector. This move is indeed powerful. If Austria directly executes Joseph Loy, Austria will look happy, but in the eyes of Joseph Loy's supporters and ordinary Swiss people who don't know the truth, it will be completely opposite. But if Joseph Loy is not executed, or if his punishment is too light, it will cause endless disasters and give people an image of weakness. This dilemma is exactly what the French want to see, but Franz does not intend to wander in the opponent's thinking trap. Joseph Loy, a failed patriot, had only been captured for more than 10 days, and his blonde hair was already grey. "Hello, Mr. Joseph Loy," Franz said very politely. Joseph Roy smiled and looked at Franz. "Ah, you the Archduke who will inherit the Austrian throne. Is our Swiss threat to you that great? The Habsburg family actually sent 2 Archduke. Right. We in Switzerland lost this battle with you. Haha. Just this one time we lost everything, but I have to admit that Archduke Karol is really powerful. He defeated our army of 200,000 with only 40,000 people. It would be great if we also had a Napoleon in Switzerland. Maybe we could fight as far as Vienna." Joseph Roy was talking to himself. In fact, he wanted to take the initiative in speaking, but Franz had no other purpose for his trip, so he just followed him. In fact, strictly speaking, your soldiers cannot be called soldiers at all. The fighting between the two sides is still stuck in the last century. The attrition due to other reasons is at least 3 times that of the battle. It makes sense that Grandpa Karl can defeat you. As for whether there is a Napoleon in Switzerland, I don't know, but General Duffer is a respectable man. If the opponent is replaced by Constantin Sigwalt and Ulrich Salis, he will end the war before the European countries become active. Historically, Duffer ended the war in 27 days, at a cost of only 78 killed and 260 injured. Joseph Loy laughed. "Indeed. Those 2 idiots Constantine and Ulrich are actually afraid that I will break my promise and kill them. What's the use of me killing 2 pigs? Haha, but don't worry. We Switzerland will not perish. The Shinra of those days couldn't defeat us. Even Napoleon can't defeat us. It is even more impossible for Austria to defeat us. You Austrians are indeed fierce jackals, but don't forget that there is a lion beside you. Now that Switzerland is gone, hungry lions will tear you apart sooner or later. By then we, Switzerland, will be able to become a nation again. France and Austria, you will pay a bloody price for today's greed. You're a really good politician, but everything you can think of can be thought of by others." As Franz spoke, he took out a prepared strategic distribution map. Joseph Loy stared at the colorful new map of Switzerland for a long time and was speechless. "Ah. You Austrians going to war just because of that piece of ancestral land? Just say that we can discuss it." Franz shook his head. "Most of those who died were people loyal to the Swiss Confederation or people who were forced to be loyal to the Swiss Confederation." Joseph Loy was speechless for a moment. Franz was right. This was a civil war in Switzerland, and of course the people who died were Swiss. He thought for a long time and spoke again. "I said I'm a patriot. Do you believe me?" Chapter 819. The Boers are also human beings. Franz nodded, but that wasn't important. "Want to smoke? Give me a cigar, please." Franz nodded, and Bordeaux took out a cigar and a box of matches and handed them to Joseph Loy. The latter failed to ignite the match after rubbing it several times. This was not because the Austrian matches were of poor quality, nor was it because Franz had done anything to tease him, but because Joseph Loy's hands kept shaking. Finally, there was a crisp sound, and the match was lit. Joseph Roy took a hard breath, and then slowly blew out a smoke ring. "Is this a good cigar, French, or a Spanish Cuban cigar?" "This is a product from the Nicaragua region of Austria and Central America, and its quality is not inferior to that of Cuban cigars." Later generations of Nicaraguan cigars are indeed not inferior to Cuban cigars in terms of quality, but due to the long-term war, their reputation is far less than that of Cuban cigars. The same is true at this time, but one of the important reasons is that the Austrian Empire is not strong enough and has insufficient influence. Even though French-made cigars were of inferior quality, they were still considered the best in the world. A stereotype that did not disappear until after World War II. Joseph Roy nodded and then expressed his doubts with a wry smile. "When do you plan to execute me?" Franz shook his head. "You have accumulated too much hatred. I will send you to a suitable place to judge you." Franz would have Joseph Loy and Freeholosa put on public trial in Switzerland, and then in Vienna, and then they would be sent to the Vatican to receive the Pope's final verdict. Along with them arrived 2 petitions in Switzerland and Vienna, as well as incriminating evidence against them. In fact, the Papal State had a sworn hatred with these 2 men. Joseph Roy had already wiped out the Jesuit industries and monasteries in Switzerland. Pius IX's confidant died directly in Switzerland, and this could not only ease the relationship with the papal state, but also throw the blame to the Pope. Franz prefers to pay back favors, rather than repaying debts. But whether Pius IX appreciates it or not is another question. The trial of Constantine Sigwart and Ulrich Salas might have been troublesome for Austria, but it was a sure win for the papal states. First, a church brother was killed, and then a nun was canonized. At this time, the trial of the two culprits was definitely a shot in the arm for the precarious papal state. At the same time, the final solution for Switzerland at the Congress of Vienna was finalized. Austria gets Argor, France gets Geneva and Vaud, Prussia gets Jura, and the Kingdom of Sardinia gets Valais. The remaining areas were all divided up by the German Confederation except for the state of Fribourg. The Grand Duke elected by the state of Fribourg was the Count of Chambord. This caused quite a stir at the time, but Louis Philippe finally agreed, because he felt that Fribourg was a piece of meat in his mouth. And after the Earl of Chambord has his own territory, will he give up his pursuit of the throne? In fact, Louis Philippe also tried to force the other party to submit on this condition, but he was still very firm about his throne as Earl of Chambord. As for the German princes, no one was willing to defend the border and face the French, so this hot potato was thrown to another French monarch. Then the Ticino state requested by the Kingdom of Sardinia was replaced by the Valais state, and the Valais state was more desolate than Ticino state. At the same time, he had to face the threat of France. Although Carlo Alberto was reluctant in every possible way, it was to no avail. As a result, an iron curtain came down from Jura to Valais, and the isolation zone composed of Prussia, Chambord, and the Kingdom of Sardinia separated France and the German Confederation. This is of course also within Franz's plan. After all, the thicker the buffer zone, the greater the room for maneuver. This time it was supposed to be a great victory, but when Franz returned to Vienna, he discovered that something was wrong. That is, instead of easing, the national sentiment in Germany is heading in an even more extreme direction. Austria's upper class was in a panic, and some savvy bankers were even trying to find ways to exchange precious metals and prepare to run away. All this stemmed from someone's wild words at the German Confederation Congress. In fact, the old Kurd made a not so good start. At this time, the Boers who were desperate in South Africa suddenly remembered that they might also be Germans. So Andres Pretorius came to Vienna, but the Boers were not as rich as the Luxembourgers. Even the Boer militia commander had to borrow money from others to pay for his trip, because they had less than £30 in their treasury. Andres Pretorius was one of the greatest leaders in the history of the Boers. And Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, was named after him. Andres Pretorius brought the Boers inland to escape persecution from the British. After another leader Retief was killed by the Zulus, in order to protect the safety of the remaining people, he recruited 500 militiamen, and finally defeated the Zulus dozens of times his own in the Battle of Blood River. The Zulus, who probably numbered over 15,000 at the time, ultimately left behind 3,000 corpses, while the Boers lost not a single soldier. However, being able to defeat the natives does not mean that he can defeat Britain, the most powerful country in the world at this time. The British have always been good at misbehaving. The Cape Colony was once one of the many colonies of the Netherlands, and later passed to the British for various reasons. In order to pass on its own internal conflicts, the British chose to immigrate to the Cape Colony, where the Boers occupied a large amount of land and had a tradition of autonomous parliaments. This is what the British did not want to see, so they came to drain the firewood. The British government declared the Cape Colony a royal territory, and no longer allowed Boer farmers to occupy and develop it for free. Instead, it implemented a land auction system and had to pay land rent for developed land. At the same time, British colonial officials also implemented a system of discrimination against the Boers, restricted the Boers from migrating north of the Orange River, and abolished the slavery system on which the Boers relied for survival. At that time, the Boers in the Cape Colony mainly relied on plantations and pastures, which required a large number of slaves. The abolition of slavery was tantamount to destroying their economic foundation. As the number of British people in the Cape Colony continued to increase, conflicts with the Boers also increased. and the legal weapons held by British officials made it impossible for the Boers to fight against them. As a result, a large number of Boers who felt uneasy and dissatisfied abandoned their pastures and houses, left the land where they had lived for generations, and moved inland. The Boers established the Natal Republic in 1838, but the British were not prepared to let them go, and annexed the Natal Republic in 1842. Afterwards, Andries Pretorius led his people to flee further inland to Orange. In 1847, Britain expanded to Orange again. Chapter 820. Hard to guard against. Andries Pretorius knew very well that he could not fight against the British invasion. He had been to Europe and had seen the power of the British, so he knew very well that, even if the Boers fought to the last man, they would not be able to defeat this powerful enemy. However, Andries Pretorius retreated again and again, while the British advanced again and again. Every time the Boers developed a piece of land and conquered a piece of pasture, they had to pay blood and sweat. The migration path is never easy. On the way, they have to face various poisonous insects, ferocious beasts, and terrible malaria. Many Boers lost their lives on the road, and not all land was suitable for development, at least not according to the level of technology at the time. The land was too poor to support the large population and livestock, and famine soon occurred. As people and animals starved to death and the plague arrived as expected, they were forced to abandon the land they had just acquired and continue to migrate inland. Among them, the experience of Louis Tricker is the most representative. At first, they left the Cape Colony with nearly 200 people. In order to avoid the British and indigenous people, they chose a relatively remote land. Louis Tricker and other Boers worked hard for a year, and as a result, many wheats did not bear ears during the harvest season. So they could only make a living by hunting wild animals, and soon the animals became scarce. At the same time, a disease called sleeping sickness began to break out among livestock. Cattle were the Boers' most valuable asset, so they had to move again. As a result, there was a problem on the route and they deviated from the original route. First came Louis Tricker's father, then his wife, and then his 2 children. When his team came to the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, he was the only one left among the dozen or so members of the family. The Aboriginals also caused big trouble to the migrating Boers, and under the influence of Black Lives Matter, the Boer Blood River battle was portrayed as a massacre. But in fact, before that, the Boer leader Retief negotiated with the Zulu people. The latter claimed that, as long as the Boers could help them recover their lost herds, they could allow the former to settle here and allocate some land to them grazing. So Retief excitedly went to war with another tribe and recaptured the herd. When Retief took the herd and his army, less than 100 people, to the Zulu people to fulfill their promise, the Zulu leader Gunnin asked the Boers to put down their weapons and go to the big hut according to Zulu tradition, waiting inside. So Retief put down his weapons and took the people to the big hut, a place similar to the tribal meeting hall, and then a group of Zulu warriors rushed in and executed all the unarmed Boers, crackling the head with wooden sticks and stone hammers. Seems to be related to some kind of taboo ritual. In the end, after Andries Pretorius won the Battle of the Blood River, he could only identify the deceased from his clothes and belongings. It was precisely because of these blood, tears, and sweat that the Boers were unwilling to give up their hard-won land. Andries Pretorius heard about Luxembourg by chance. He thinks that he also speaks German, so does that mean he is also German? As a result, Pretorius went to find the Dutch businessman again, and by coincidence, the latter happened to be a Dutch businessman, but he was actually a Luxembourger and an extreme nationalist. Under his instigation, Pretorius decided to go to Vienna, but he did not know where Austria was, so he had to take a boat to the Netherlands first. King William II of the Netherlands was not interested in such non-Dutch colonial matters. In fact, Pretorius had no one to introduce him, because he did not have enough money to pay the bribe. After traveling to Luxembourg, the people of Luxembourg were moved by his deeds and even donated a sum of money to him. Speaker Kerda Jr. personally took him to Vienna to attend the German Confederation Conference. However, due to the matter of land division, young Kerda temporarily put aside the matter of Pretorius. Pretorius also had a good look at Vienna, the most prosperous city in the German Confederation. In his eyes, this place is much better than the gloomy London, and national sentiment is very contagious. It happened that the German Confederation Congress was convened, and nationalists from all walks of life gathered here. Then came one victory after another. The streets and alleys of Vienna were bombarded with good news. Propaganda was everywhere in the streets and people were talking about these things. Old Pretorius was also successfully brainwashed into a German nationalist. When the young Kerdri, who was full of gains, remembered the incident of Old Pretorius, the Congress of Vienna had ended, all the monarchs had left, and all that was to be held was a regular meeting of the German Confederation. But the latter's mood at this time not only did not subside, but a strong sense of national pride arose spontaneously. He had never been so proud in his life. So the old Pretorius made an impassioned speech and spoke loudly at the German Confederation Congress. The scalp of Count Pillersdorf, the representative of the Austrian Empire, exploded with anger looking at the silent venue. Earl Pillersdorf let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, the guy from Lens was sent to California, otherwise we don't know what trouble would have happened. If young people are angry and say something random, you must know that they are the British, the world's hegemon. The most critical thing is that the Austrian Empire has no navy, and the damn Boers live on the other side of the world. If a war breaks out between Austria and Britain, then the good times for the Austrians will be over at this point. As a high-ranking figure in the government, Count Pillersdorf knew exactly how much benefit the colony would provide to Austria every year. In addition, the overseas trade of the Austrian Empire has experienced an extremely exaggerated increase in recent years, and the market has expanded to all parts of the world. All of these require smooth sea routes, otherwise resources cannot be transported in, domestic goods cannot be transported out, and overseas markets and colonies will be lost sooner or later. The British rose up on the corpses of the Spanish and French, and Count Pillersdorf did not want Austria to be next. At this time, he discovered that the young man he was taking was acting strangely, as if there was a prehistoric power running around in his body. Fortunately, Earl Pillersdorf quickly restrained the young man next to him. He hated this kind of intern policy, where the old leads the new. Some young people always can't control their hands and mouths. Fortunately, he is a mature and steady diplomat. However, he miscalculated, and what Franz least wanted to see happened. One lens fell down, and thousands of lens stood up. The original Confederate Congress turned into a nationalist feast, with young people in the audience shouting, "Down with the British, save our African compatriots, long live Germany." The German nationalists made a fuss at the German Confederation Conference, and demanded the dispatch of troops to Orange, which cast a shadow over the original victory of the Congress of Vienna. Chapter 821 Nonsense. While the public sentiment was turbulent and the governments of various countries were struggling, Andres Pretorius and Councillor Kerdri were drinking wine happily. But after a few glasses of wine, old Pretorius burst into tears. "We Boers were first abandoned by our king, and then expelled by our masters. Unexpectedly, today there are so many people who have nothing to do with us who are willing to help us fight against the most powerful country in the world." Note: the Boers were originally Dutch immigrants in the Cape Colony, but after the Napoleonic Wars they were sold to the British by the current king's father, Merchant King William I, for £6 million. The British later became the masters of the Cape Colony, but they did not like the Aboriginal people, and it had nothing to do with their skin color. Although little Kaldray was drunk, he was not confused. After all, the two people live in different environments. Old Pretorius faces more poisonous insects and beasts and primitive tribes, and most of his enemies show their hostility. Congressman Kerder Jr. is a politician and faces countless enemies every day. Unclear open and hidden arrows. Old Pretorius's unintentional words were like a bolt from the blue to young Kerdri. Only then did the latter realize that he might have been deceived, and that his national sentiments had been deceived cold. How can it be irrelevant? The former also came back to his senses at this time, and found that his words were indeed inappropriate. In fact, the Boers are their own name, and other countries do not recognize it. And that sentence of irrelevance is indeed very hurtful. Although the elder Pretorius originally meant a relatively distant person, it does sound like he is playing on national sentiments, but he couldn't think of an excuse for the moment. After all, he had never encountered such a situation before. Finally, little Kerdri said with a smile, "There are no Boers or Luxembourgers here. Today we are all Germans. Come, let us drink to the great German nation." When The people around heard Mr. Congressman say this. They thought that bull was a place name, so they didn't pay much attention to it. Everyone raised their glasses and started drinking. Respect the nation. Respect Germany. This kind of sound made some people in the tavern unhappy. This was Vienna, where the upper class elites of all ethnic groups in the Austrian Empire and those who wanted to climb up gathered here. They might not like this atmosphere. In fact, nationalism is poison to stitch monsters like Austria, because the strength of some people will make others appear weak, and contradictions will emerge endlessly. After the cocktail party, Congressman Kurt Jr. came to the temporary Confederate headquarters in Vienna again. He applied for a thorough and detailed investigation of Andres Pretorius. The latter drank so much that he could only walk with help, but he immediately woke up after returning to his room. Old Pretorius could clearly feel that he was being protected, or in other words, being monitored. But he had no choice. It was the Luxembourgers who brought him, and even if he escaped, he would have nowhere to go, not to mention that his previous efforts would be wasted. So old Pretorius put the primer on his gun and fell asleep. His experience in the colony made his nerves both sensitive and thick. He could still sleep, even if someone was watching him. On the other hand, the German nationalists began to join forces. They decided to make a big news and planned to besiege the British embassy first. However, as soon as this group of people set out on the road, they found that the road was full of checkpoints and military police. They were all arrested on various charges before they even reached the British embassy. For example, drinking and causing trouble, spitting, making loud noises, etc. In fact, the top leaders in Vienna were relatively relaxed. Because the German Confederation had expanded, they could declare the previous meeting invalid and convene the Confederation Congress again. This time, some reliable people would be replaced to vote again. Moreover, Metternich felt that, since the Boers could not survive in the British territory, they would just go to the Austrian territory. Anyway, France spends a lot of money to invite immigrants every year. It is better to directly use the waste to send the Boers to the Tanzania Governorate, or directly break up the scattered colonies in West Africa. In fact, Metternich's ideas and methods were correct, but what he didn't know was that the world's largest gold and diamond mines were buried under the land of the Transvaal. Andres Pretorius and the Boers were sitting on a golden mountain without knowing it, but Franz, the time traveler, knew it all, so he could not just move away. Since the stakes were so high, almost all the top officials of the Austrian Empire gathered together. The outspoken Count Latter spoke first. Today's young people are getting more and more outrageous. They dare to say and do anything. Franz scratched his forehead. I'm not talking about you, Archduke Franz. Cough. Cough cough. Friedrich coughed again in displeasure. I'm not talking about you either, Your Excellency, the commander of the navy. Archduke Friedrich in history had already drowned at this time. It seems that he accidentally fell into the water while patrolling a warship at night. It is also said that the sailors mutinied and pushed him into the water. However, it is true that the naval commander drowned in the sea. Very ironic. However, history has changed now. After Friedrich married Princess Sneaker, he would not be so bored as to patrol warships in the middle of the night. Friedrich did not go to the port and naturally did not fall into the water. However, according to his attendants, the Grand Duke almost drowned in the bathtub a few days ago while playing with the Grand Duchess. This may be the final stubbornness of the god of death closer to home. Count Latter is not optimistic about the prospects of this war. The British maritime power is too strong. Most of the German states are landlocked. The Danish navy is eager to try, but they don't have battleships. The Danes? How could they have a hand in it? Asked Julius Hainaut. The King of Denmark is also the Grand Duke of Holstein, and the relationship between the Danes and the British is very bad, except that they don't have the wood to build ships. Count Latter continued after explaining, other countries can't count on it, and our navy is too weak. I don't agree. Friedrich said very unhappily, we can destroy the British Mediterranean fleet and seize Crete in 15 days, but can your army take the Strait of Gibraltar? Our maritime power is not weak, but we cannot break through the Strait of Gibraltar. Count Latter was a little helpless. He had no way to deal with the son of his old boss, and he didn't understand the navy, but he could still tell which side had more ships and which side had fewer ships, so he felt that Archduke Friedrich could only he's just trying to show off his strength point. However, Friedrich had actually been preparing for this day for many years. He planned 9 different plans to seize the island, of which 15 days was the slowest. Chapter 820 to send troops, pay for it. At this time, all the battleships of the Austrian Imperial Navy had been converted to steam power, so they could maintain high speed in the windless zone of the Mediterranean, which the British Navy obviously could not yet. Moreover, the main battleships of the Austrian Empire have basically completed armor transformation, and even early airships have been successfully tested. If the British and Austrian main fleets encountered each other with similar numbers, Friedrich felt that his chances of winning were 99%, and the remaining 1% would be due to extreme situations such as tsunamis or meteor showers. As for seizing the island, it is not a problem. Over the years, Friedrich has intensively pondered the British Mediterranean Navy and cultivated a large number of internal agents on the island of Crete. It is no exaggeration to say that Friedrich knew every move on Crete even better than the British commander of the Mediterranean Navy. As for the Albanian fleet used to deter Austria, it was too delicate. The Austrian Navy could completely crush it, or directly let the army attack their ports. To be honest, the British garrison in Albania did not feel that they could hold the Austrians by the throat, and they had already been beaten out of temper by the local guerrillas and mercenaries. In fact, Franz often sent his mercenaries, who were skilled in assassination, to circle around the British station twice when they had nothing to do. Franz didn't want those British guys to be idle at the door of Austria's house. They had to know that they were just abandoned sons of the British, just lambs to be slaughtered. The annual attrition of up to 40% caused the British Navy to talk about this place internally and gave it a very Greek name, Gates of Hades. Friedrich's insistence made Count Latter very embarrassed. Although the latter was the former's boss, he was also an old subordinate of Archduke Karol, and it was not a smart move to ask a member of the royal family to apologize to him in the dynasty. So Count Latter could only apologize and explain, "I don't know much about the situation of the navy, but the Strait of Gibraltar does not border our country. The army has to pass through France and Spain to reach it. This is something we can't do, but if we let our army have a head-on confrontation on land, it will definitely make the British cry. Father calls mother, due to some changes in the political, economic, cultural, diplomatic, military, and technological fields. Austria's top leadership is now extremely bloated. Metternich dared to go to war with France before, but now the two military bosses clamoring to beat the British was just a microcosm. But they still think of the war too simply. If it is a short-lasting local war, Austria is now very confident that it will beat the opponent to the ground before the opponent can react. But what if it is a long-term all-out war? If the attack fails for a long time and the war reaches a stalemate and is consumed, then Austria itself will be the first to collapse. Those contradictions concealed by rapid economic development and high welfare will erupt in a concentrated manner. The more people support the empire now, the more they hope the empire will be destroyed by then. In fact, the issue of the Strait of Gibraltar is a common problem in the entire Mediterranean countries. Austria can join France and Spain to challenge the United Kingdom and let them feel the maliciousness from the European continent. Then contact the United States, Brazil, Oman, Afghanistan, and Indian states to attack the British at the same time. The armies of Nanming and Chenla can completely cut off the Strait of Malacca. After all, Singapore is dominated by Chinese, and the surrounding aboriginal living areas have been completely penetrated by the church. When the time comes, the inside and outside should be coordinated, and the chances of winning with deliberate calculations and unintentional calculations should be very high. But the problem is that even this may not necessarily defeat the British, because this alliance does not have a real core, and each member is easily satisfied. As long as the British are willing to provide ships, some will withdraw from the war or even switch sides. The entire conference hall soon became noisy, and Franz's behavior of selling grain to Britain at a low price, relatively low, but several times higher than at home, met with a lot of opposition. The senior officials felt that as long as Austria stopped selling grain to the British, there would be a famine in Britain. By then, the British would not be able to take care of themselves and would not choose to go to war, but what they didn't know was that the grain France sold to the British was profitable, and it was an important measure to ensure that domestic grain prices would not be too low and lead to a decline in farmers' living standards. Sometimes money is the most advantageous proof. Franz took out the financial report that he had prepared and handed it to every senior official. At this time, someone already understood what Franz meant. Prince Metternich asked, "Archduke Franz, do you want it?" "Yes, I'm opposed to sending troops, but I'm not opposed to paying money. And the Transvaal area is just a barren land. I think as long as we are willing to pay, the British will be very willing to talk to us." Have you ever thought about how much economic losses we would suffer if we went to war with the British? How many families will lose their children? What if we lose? Will they cede territory and seek peace, or accept a humiliating treaty? Will neighboring countries take this opportunity to add insult to injury? After being poured cold water on Franz, the mood of the senior officials finally eased, and they soon discovered that what Franz said was not wrong. Rather than crossing the ocean to fight an uncertain war, perhaps buying it with money is a better choice. Friedrich agreed with this point. Although he wanted to fight the British, as the richest aristocratic family in Austria, he had been taught, since he was a child, that problems that could be solved with money were not problems. Moreover, the Austrian navy was not ready for a war with Britain, because the British fleet had too many, and it was not a problem that could be solved in one battle. In addition to the number of ships, the British production capacity is also terrible. They can build a fleet in a very short time, which is something no other country in the world can do. As for Count Latter, he was not very advocating war, because his army had no use at all, unless he went to fight Albania. But that is just a port garrisoned by 3,000 people. Austria can destroy it with up to 20,000 people, but what does that have to do with the outcome of the entire war? Although Archduke Friedrich did achieve many epic victories, they were all against some indigenous and Arabs. The British had achieved even more amazing results in the East, so this kind of war against non-Western countries had no reference value in his eyes. Prince Metternich always thought that Franz was very rich, but he did not expect to have so much money. There were too many unknowns about war with the British, but negotiations were well within his realm. Although Count Korolaf was a Croatian, he was a fanatical German nationalist and he himself felt that he was German. However, old Pretorius's Boer words had reached his ears, and Count Korolaf did not want to be taken advantage of. But if he paid for the land, he supported it with both hands. After all, even if it was proved that the Boers were not Germans, the land still belonged to Austria, and at least he would not lose money by doing so. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 823. The British are also afraid. London, England. In order to prevent France and Spain from coming together at this critical juncture before Isabella II's accession to the throne, the British were prepared to support Carlos again. It's just that old Carlos has given up his right to inherit the throne, and he is an extremely superstitious and stubborn guy. So the British chose his son, Roberto Carlos, and it happened that there were both natural and man-made disasters. In Spain. As mentioned before, natural disasters include volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, fungal diseases, etc. In Catalonia and other regions, a so-called man-made disaster is the repeated tyranny of Queen Regent Christiana and the military government. The formulation and execution of policies by both parties have reached the level of inappropriateness. Moreover, many policies of both sides are contradictory, and the chaos in the entire Spanish region can be imagined. Although the French later forcibly replaced the military government, the power of the military government was not eradicated. The most important thing is that Spain's national fortunes are declining at this time, coupled with the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the entry of French goods. It is not something that Christiana, a bad woman who only knows how to fight in the palace, can solve it. What's more, Queen Regent Christiana doesn't want to solve the problem. She just wants to get enough pension before her daughter reaches adulthood. Christiana's lovers took turns on the stage, and these people, like the Queen Regent, did not care about the life or death of the Spaniards. So when Prince Carlos, who was supported by the British, decided to provoke a civil war, he immediately received a wide response, especially the remaining forces from the military government period who hit it off point. So the Carlos War 2.0 was about to be staged with great fanfare, and at this time the Germans suddenly found out that the Boers had German ancestry. What the hell is this? The first reaction of almost all British politicians was the same. They didn't quite know what was going on in Austria. To actually do such a stupid thing, across Africa, to start a war that has no chance of winning. This should be the case, but now Britain itself has a little problem. The Spanish Civil War was about to begin, and the British were most likely going to fight the French. This was originally a guaranteed war, but what if a war started with the German Confederacy at this time? What about Americans? Although John Russell had just convinced Pope not long ago, the latter is known as the toughest president in American history. Will he add insult to injury? There are great differences within Whitehall. Some people feel that the British Empire is invincible and fully capable of facing any challenge. Others feel that, no matter how powerful Britain is, it is still too risky to go to war with the whole world. But more British politicians believe that it is not worthwhile. Even if it wins a war with the whole world, it will do more harm than good to Britain. Factories will be depressed, trade will shrink, and many financiers' investments abroad will be in vain. And how long will this war last? 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, like the war that collapsed 3 empires. As for the so-called Boers, many senior British officials had never heard of them, and the Transvaal was a barren land. Many people had heard of them for the first time. Palmerston spoke directly. He could not stand the shrinking look of his colleagues. Whether it's Germany or Austria, if they want it, just give it to them. The so-called Boers as a whole are no more than 20,000 people. The Transvaal seems to be called this, and it is just a piece of pasture that has just been leveled. It is not cost effective to go to war with the entire German Confederation, just for such a small amount of land and population. Humph, you put it lightly. What if the German Confederation's appetite is not just the Transvaal, but the entire Cape Colony? The Colonial Secretary, Earl Henry Grey, said very unhappily that he hated that his colonial office was being looked down upon, so he retorted. But Earl Grey ignored one problem. Palmerston was not an easy person to deal with. My dear Earl, let me ask you, is it along the coast of the Transvaal? No, the Transvaal is landlocked. Then, how can the 20,000 Boers counterattack the Cape Colony, which has a population of 100,000? This Namibia colony next door to Austria is rich in gold and diamonds. Why don't you capture it together? It will not only solve the Cape Colony's worries, but also open up territory for our British Empire. What do you think? The port of Namibia is not difficult to conquer, but the Austrian colony of Namibia is built on the mountains in the interior. What is even more terrifying is that if you want to attack the interior, you must first cross a large desert. After the soldiers cross the desert, they only have half a life, let alone attacking the city. It is hard to say whether they will surrender directly at that time. The so-called Gate of Hell is not called for nothing. As for the 20,000 Boers, most of them were old, weak, women and children. Because wars often broke out, and they had to deal with a lot of labor, the adult men suffered a great loss. The number of people who could carry guns was probably only 3 to 5,000. The British Cape Colony was used to house veterans of the war. It not only had sufficient manpower, but also had a large number of trained soldiers and descendants of soldiers. Note, there were nearly 100,000 white people in the Cape Colony, while the number of black people was about half that of white people. The Colonial Secretary, Earl Henry Grey, just snorted and did not answer, but Palmerston was unwilling to give up. Why don't you take down Austria's East African colonies and the Oman Empire as well? That's enough. John Russell stopped the quarrel among the cabinet members. He hated Palmerston, but he couldn't do anything to ruin the overall situation because of such a small thing. The Transvaal can be ceded to them, but they must promise to remain neutral for the rest of the war. When The Prime Minister speaks, the cabinet members still have to show some respect. And this method seems to be the most reasonable approach at this time point. However, before the British could send a messenger to the German Confederation, the latter's messenger arrived first, hoping that the two sides could negotiate to resolve the issue. This was a relief to the British, and it seemed that the Austrians did not want to fight. In fact, it is not difficult to think that Austria has just offended France on the Swiss issue, and it would be very unwise to start a war with Britain at this time point, so negotiation became the most reasonable choice for both parties. In fact, the monarchs of the German states also opposed war with the British, so the German Confederation held its first expanded conference, including the Swiss states, except for Luxembourg, which abstained from voting. Almost all states voted against it. However, in order to take care of national sentiment, the German Confederation would not abandon its compatriots in southern Africa, so it planned to solve the problem through redemption. However, it was okay not to talk about money. When it came to talking about money, the monarchs of various states were a little reluctant. However, domestic nationalists were making a big fuss, so they had no choice but to compromise. Fortunately, the Transvaal is a barren land, and most of the land is still in native hands, so the price should not be very high. But the words of British Foreign Secretary Palmerston made people dumbfounded. £10 million. Chapter 824 Transaction. Accident. Frankfurt, temporary conference center of the German Confederation. This is often changed, otherwise other countries in the Confederation are unwilling, mainly Prussia. What is the concept of £10 million? It is equivalent to 2 years of fiscal revenue of the United States and half a year of Prussia's fiscal revenue during the same period in history. It is not a small number even for the entire German Confederation. 10 million florins. Prince Metternich, the representative of the Austrian Empire, directly gave another figure tit for tat. 10 million florins was equivalent to £1 million, which was 1/10 of what Palmerston said. As soon as the negotiations began, the dialogue between the two sides was a bit jaw-dropping. Many representatives of small countries felt that the two sides would not be able to reach an agreement and would eventually go to war, but it's none of their business. After all, they don't even have a navy. Among the German states, only a few have navies, including Austria, Prussia, Hanover, and Denmark. The other countries either don't have one, or are just like a joke. In fact, the vast majority of countries are not only unwilling to fight, but also unwilling to pay. However, due to the domestic situation, they have to step forward. As a result, all the delis near the venue were sold out. After all, these gentlemen like to nibble on pig's trotters and chicken drumsticks when they have nothing to do. How can we have meat without wine? There is wine and meat. How can we not be accompanied by a beautiful woman? They really didn't dare to do this. Women's social status was very low at that time. If they really called some prostitutes, it would become an international joke. But even so, the scene was very shocking, and Palmerston was speechless looking at the group of little people in front of him. But the price offered by Metternich felt low to him. Although the Transvaal was a barren land, it was also the territory of the British Empire. In this world, only the United States, the rebellious son, has ceded territory from the British Empire. Palmerston feels that the price must not be too low, otherwise future generations will be left with nothing to lose, so they will not hesitate to give to others. 20 million pounds. 5 million florins. Palmerston and Metternich spoke calmly, but the Prussian and Danish representatives could not sit still. There is no other reason, that is to go to war with Britain, and they will be the biggest victims. Even though Austria can't get out due to its broken terrain, it's also very difficult for others to get in. And Austria also has strong army support. But the same cannot be said for Prussia and Denmark. The British could easily destroy their coastal areas. 5 million pounds. Deal. But in our expected currency, half gold, half silver, half banknotes. 80% expected banknotes, 20% gold. Make a deal. While everyone was still confused, Palmerston and Metternich reached a deal. It was Franz who proposed using expected banknotes to pay. Although expected banknotes have the same payment capabilities as real money and silver, it is not that easy. To redeem them. The British can only choose to consume within the German Confederation, which can also promote internal development. And the money will be paid off within 5 years, so there is no need to worry about inflation. In fact, London did not have high expectations for the outcome of this negotiation, because the so-called Transvaal was still the territory of the Eastern Bantu people at this time, and there are not many resources in this area. At least British geologists and expeditions did not find anything valuable when they passed by. But after all, it is a large piece of land, and it is close to the British Cape Colony, so £1 million is the British bottom line. Their main purpose was to prevent Austria or the German Confederation from intervening in a possible war, so Palmerston did not mind what the remaining £4 million was used to pay for the German Confederation. The Spanish Civil War has nothing to do with it. After all, there is France in the middle. But some experienced politicians have understood the meaning. But since the Austrian Empire doesn't mind, those small countries that have no possibility of hegemony naturally don't care either. Metternich naturally understood that the British were going to attack the Franco-Spanish alliance, which was good news for Austria. Remaining neutral and watching the French take a beating was, in Metternich's view, Austria's best choice. Although Austria's security was threatened by Britain several times, in Metternich's view, the old rival the French were more hateful. Moreover, he felt that the dismantling of the Franco-Spanish alliance would be of great benefit to Austria, but in fact it was a mixed blessing. After all, if the Franco-Spanish alliance continued to exist, it would share the firepower of the British. However, as the year of the storm is coming, the so-called Franco-Spanish alliance is very likely to become the first victim of this storm. In the end, the German Confederation purchased the land in the Transvaal for £5 million, and the Transvaal officially became a member of the German Confederation. £5 million was to be paid in 5 years, 80% of which was to be paid in futures banknotes, and the remainder to be paid in equivalent gold or silver. However, the Transvaal could not exist as a commercial republic, but Andries Pretorius was firmly opposed to arranging a state for them, even as a member of the Dutch royal family. This actually allowed the Boers to offend all the German monarchies almost at once. And Congressman Curdry even thought he was crazy. You must know that Luxembourg is already considered an outlier, but they still nominally respect the King of the Netherlands as the Grand Duke. Metternich also felt that these guys were ignorant. Will the German Confederation rebel just after redeeming them? At this time, almost all states hoped to expel the Transvaal from its German citizenship, so that they could throw away this burden. So the German Confederation held another congress, and almost all states opposed the inclusion of the Transvaal into the German Confederation. Prussia's new foreign minister Karl von Kaunitz stood up and suggested, since it was a deal negotiated between Prince Metternich and Palmerston, why not make it a colony of the Austrian Empire? The Prussians opened their mouths, and the other states immediately followed suit, especially the Danes, who had eaten gualeo and shouted loudly, "The non-Austrian Empire is not enough to deter the indigenous Africans, and Austria already has colonies in East Africa. As long as it buys the Portuguese's Mozambique, it can be connected." Note: eating melons and fishing means unreasonable disasters. The most panicked person at this time was Andries Pretorius. If the Transvaal became an Austrian colony, would it suffer the same fate again? If he was expelled again, he really didn't know what he would do when he went back to meet his fellow villagers. A good backer was about to become the straw that broke the camel's back. Metternich was helpless in the face of this situation, but Archduke Franz seemed to be very knowledgeable about the situation in the colonies, and the latter might be able to give good suggestions. In fact, Metternich was still unwilling to bear this amount alone. Although the Austrian Empire at this time was much richer than in its original history, he could not accept the waste of money in irrelevant places. Chapter 825 Shared Colonies. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. When Franz was still planning how to develop the gold mines in the Transvaal without being discovered by other countries, the elder Pretorius's gaffe at the German Confederation Congress forced the former to reconsider his plans. Austria's monopolization of the Transvaal was not good news at this time. The common man was not guilty, but he was guilty of carrying the treasure. This was how the Boers became the dead souls of the British. Pretorius the Elder did not want the kingdom, and whether Franz sympathized with the Boers or not, it was impossible to support such a person from the latter's position. Since they don't want to be a country, they can only be a colony. The remaining problem is how to rule this distant land. The Boers are not a bloodless race. From the Battle of Blood River and the later Anglo-Boer War, it can be seen that this nation is very tough and not afraid of strong enemies. Franz even began to regret getting involved in South Africa too early, regretting helping this group of guys who called themselves Germans and didn't want to be controlled by the German Confederation. In fact, it is not right to say this. After all, the reason why this matter is causing trouble is entirely due to the fanaticism of nationalism. Rather than helping them, it is better to say that it is forced by the Democrats compared with the subsequent year of 1848. This time was just the drizzle before the storm. The issue of how to control the Transvaal is not urgent, but it is not simple. Taking strong measures like the British will definitely not work. It's not that the war is unwinnable, but the price is too high. The Austrian mainland is too far away from the Transvaal, and if you are not careful, you may repeat the mistakes of the British in history. The Anglo-Boer War was the most costly period in the long colonial history of the British. Even the famous Churchill became a prisoner of war of the Boers in the end. The number of the British expeditionary force even exceeded the total local population. After paying an extremely heavy price, the protracted war was barely won by relying on the scorched earth policy. Although Austria has 2 colonies in southern Africa, Tanzania and Namibia, it currently does not have the ability to connect them to the Transvaal. The Transvaal and the Austrian East African colonies were separated by Portuguese Mozambique, and there were no developed routes and land. As for the colony of Namibia, it seems that it is very close to the Transvaal, but it is blocked by high mountains and is almost impassable, and it still has to face the harsh natural environment of the African interior and the savage and warlike indigenous people. But there is no need to worry too much, because this time it is just the personal behavior of old Pretorius, and does not represent all Boers. It was not difficult for Franz to divide and disintegrate them. But it was too early to take action against the faraway Transvaal at this time. And the most important point is that at this time, the Transvaal and Orange were poor and useless places. Otherwise, the British would not have given up such a large colony half sold, half gifted. In fact, it is wrong to say so, because the British have not yet taken possession of this land. There is really no reason why the British should not do this kind of generosity to others. As for the 5 million, or the 1 million to be delivered this year, it is actually a reminder for the British. Because although it is expected that banknotes have the same purchasing power as metal currency within the German Confederation, the British can only buy things within the German Confederation. With 20% cash and 80% goods, Britain's economic crisis will become even more serious. In fact, this is also digesting the gold in Franz's hands. Sometimes having more money is not necessarily a good thing. Franz had to consider the relationship between economic development and money supply. There should not be too much money in the market, nor too little money, in case Austria ended up following the footsteps of the Spanish Empire. But this game will soon become unplayable, because new giant gold mines will be discovered. Although Franz also made arrangements, it was impossible to monopolize it, and it was even more impossible to prevent the news from being leaked. Therefore, Franz must put his gold into the market as soon as possible and reasonably, so as to reduce the impact he suffers for the Transvaal. Franz was only prepared to send some missionaries and teachers. Compared to military conquest and economic control, Franz found it easier to start with culture and ideology. First, we must cultivate a group of real Germans. At the same time, we must let the locals know what the German Confederation has done. We must not make people think that this is the personal credit of the old Pretorius. If necessary, Franz would not mind having one more floating corpse in the Atlantic Ocean. It is completely unnecessary to send officials at this time, and it is a bad idea, not to mention whether the local people will accept the management. In such a desolate, remote and poor place, these officials who had seen the world either bullied the locals to death or were bullied to death by the locals compared to them. The Boers who have lived there for hundreds of years must be more familiar with the local conditions. They don't do much except create conflicts and chaos as for missionaries and teachers. These people have more communication with the grassroots, know how to use things other than power to subjugate others, and can more easily integrate into the local circle. Finally, regarding the nature of the land, Franz felt that the Transvaal, actually including Orange, could be regarded as a German Confederate colony. Metternich felt a headache for Franz's proposal, because judging from the situation, other countries are not prepared to pay £5 million to be paid in 5 years is not a small amount of money. Archduke Franz, I hope you can understand one thing. That is, other princes are not prepared to pay this money. Is it feasible for our country to develop it exclusively? The old prime minister was also helpless. After all, there were not many countries with colonies in the entire German Confederation. Austria is the only country with the ability to develop overseas. Even if it is shared by other countries, it will not be able to allocate much money. If a country is established, then the account of the German Confederation can be charged to that country. Although we don't know when it will be recovered, everyone finally has something to look forward to. However, a non-monarchy was not acceptable within the German Confederation, and just looking at old Pretorius, one could tell that the Boers were definitely very poor. In addition, according to intelligence, the total population of the Transvaal is only more than 20,000. And it is impossible for them to afford to pay back the money. Seeing that the money will be wasted, who would be willing to pay for it? No, we don't yet have the ability to develop such deep inland areas, and the so-called Boers are not yet a nation. At best, they are named after geographical units, like Viennese and Venetian. As for the money, they don't have to pay it, but all countries must shoulder the task of protection and civilization. After the development is completed, the interests of the Austrian Empire will account for 80%, and it will have veto power on all matters. Metternich didn't quite understand Franz's approach. Most of the German princely states in Germany didn't even have a navy, so what defense tasks could they undertake? End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.